Disclaimer: this video contains spoilers for the Star Wars Prequel Trilogy, and both versions of the Clone Wars TV show. There are time codes in the description if you want to jump around. We all good? Incredible. Now this is where the fun begins. In the 70s and 80s, George Lucas had created the most successful film trilogy of all time. He had told a timeless story about going on the most incredible adventure of good against evil. But with the release of Return of the Jedi, that story came to an end. The adventure of Luke, Han, and Leia had come to a close, as their struggle with evil was wrapped up with the Empire's defeat. So what was George Lucas gonna do next? Well, he was gonna reinvent the way movies were made. George Lucas believed that movie making was stuck in the past, that the entire process was antiquated and inefficient. So, in the years since Return of the Jedi, he put his focus into upgrading every aspect, not just for himself or projects under Lucasfilm, but for the entire industry. Sound was first up, getting upgraded under his new subsidiary THX, which began work for Return of the Jedi, leading to the rise of digital audio editing. And film editing was soon to follow. For the longest time, film editing was built around literally cutting and splicing film with your hands, running it through a piece of hardware that could only move backwards or forwards. If you needed a new shot or you needed a couple more frames that you cut off, you had to go and physically find those pieces of film and reattach them to the reel. Lucas knew in his heart of hearts that this was outdated, and went to great pains to introduce digital, non-linear editing to the film industry, which all began with the Edit Droid, the very first non-linear digital editor. You didn't need a strip of film, you could go backwards, forwards, you could select files from different areas. It was so much simpler and easier to use. And it paved the way to the rise of Avid Media Composer in 1989, which is still, to this day, the industry standard non-linear editor. Then came the real kicker. As much as Lucas knew that editing and audio needed to transition to digital, he also believed that the world of visual effects had to go digital. That once the technology was advanced enough, computers could create images bigger than your wildest imaginations. During the 80s, ILM had a computer graphics division, headed by Ed Catmull and eventually John Lasseter, who built a device that could create these incredible digital images, the Pixar Image Computer. The only issue was that this team's goals didn't line up with Lucasfilm's goals. Lucasfilm wanted to create visual effects for live-action movies, the computer graphics department wanted to make entirely CG animated movies. So, with the technology on enough of a foundation, the computer graphics department was sold to Steve Jobs and ultimately became Pixar Animation Studios. ILM then worked to create an all-new computer graphics division, purely designed from the ground up for digital visual effects for motion pictures. And suddenly, things started moving real damn fast. A few key figures rose to prominence. Dennis Muren was one of the visual effects artists on the original Star Wars trilogy, and now he'd fully embraced the digital world and all of its possibilities. Then you had the pioneering duo Mark DePay and Steve Williams, who built and rebuilt all sorts of new programs to create never-before-seen effects. And on top of all of them, you had John Knoll, who'd been working at ILM all throughout the 80s after film school. He was very interested both in the work of the old guard who'd made the effects for the original Star Wars trilogy, but also the new work by the computer graphics department. In fact, when it was still the Pixar team, he immediately had his mind blown when he saw that they could take a piece of film and transfer it to a digital file that could then be manipulated within the computer. This small stepping stone led directly to him and his brother Thomas Knoll getting together and quite literally inventing Photoshop, a program that had the ability to take images and convert them into pixels that could be manipulated to your heart's content. With these key figures and a number of others jumping onto ILM either from the outside or from other departments, digital effects exploded. You had things like the stained glass knight in the movie Young Sherlock Holmes, you had the water pseudopod for The Abyss, even a fully liquid metal man for Terminator 2, all of which led to the real quantum leap in the year 1993. With a little old movie you might have heard of, Jurassic Park changed the world. There is no other way to say that. It really did. It was originally going to be the magnum opus for stop motion, the ultimate visual effects showcase for everything stop motion could do. But what it became was the first real showcase of what computer effects could do. The team at ILM was finally able to create creatures that looked like real living flesh and bone. Creatures that could match up to the incredible practical dinosaurs made by Stan Winston and his team on set. These models were huge, they were detailed, they were fast, they were alive. George Lucas saw what the team had come up with for Jurassic Park, and a light bulb went off in his head. It was like a eureka moment. For years, he had felt like his mind was always 10 steps ahead of technology, that his ideas were always too far-fetched to be achieved. But now, as he saw living, breathing dinosaurs created in the digital world, he knew that technology had finally caught up with him. All of his ideas now felt more achievable than ever. Which is why, after 10 years away, George Lucas made the big decision to go back to Star Wars. In the years since the original trilogy, Star Wars fans were at their most fringe state. While there was some stuff to chew on, like video games, TV specials, and even animated shows about droids and Ewoks, the franchise was nowhere near as big as it was during the release of the original movies. In fact, there was a 4-year drought from 1987 to 1991 where essentially nothing new came from the galaxy far, far away. To be a fan of Star Wars right now, you had to put a bit of work in to find new stuff and new people. Most of the mainstream world had moved on. They were focused on other things. That was until things slowly began to change with the Thrawn trilogy written by Timothy Zahn. Released from 1991 to 1993, these books were instrumental to revitalizing people's interest in Star Wars, bringing it back to the public consciousness, at least a little bit, chronicling the story after the end of Return of the Jedi, introducing a whole bunch of new concepts, characters, and even the world of Coruscant, launching the Star Wars expanded universe. These books were so wide-reaching that they can be at least partially attributed to Lucas's own re-interest in the series. Because shortly after the trilogy's release, the tide for Star Wars fans swiftly changed in a hugely exciting way in 1994. When George Lucas finally made the news official, he was coming back to Star Wars. After over a decade away, there was going to be a new Star Wars movie. The fan base rejoiced from this news. It was the best news they could have possibly hoped for. It also didn't mean that just one movie was on its way. George Lucas was coming back for the entire prequel trilogy, episodes 1, 2, and 3. Star Wars fans were suddenly going to be eating pretty damn good. After all this time, the story would be rounded out. The original trilogy would be given a companion piece to make one grand 6-movie series. Now, there weren't any plans to continue beyond Return of the Jedi, with no real motives to make 7, 8, and 9, or even 10, 11, and 12. This was gonna be it. The whole story would round out into 6 movies. Once Episode 3 hit theaters, the Star Wars saga would be complete. But there's still a long road ahead before that can happen. George Lucas was now entirely focused on making the first of these new movies, Episode 1. And writing began on November 1st, 1994. George Lucas, back with his pencil and paper, began writing the next story, the one that would begin the whole thing.
All I need is an idea.
And while the development of the movie initially started with him, as is common, the team around him began to expand in 1995, as a few key figures began to join the project very early on. You had Doug Chiang, a designer at ILM who was working extensively on ship designs behind the scenes. Drawings and illustrations that managed to serve him perfectly well to become Episode 1's design director, responsible for designing ships and the overall look of this new era. And then of course you had Rick McCallum, a producer who had worked with Lucas before for the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles in the early 90s. Now he was the lead producer for not just this first movie, but the 2 to follow. It was going to be a big partnership between these 2 guys to get these movies done. One thing that was for sure, George Lucas's ideas were going to be very ambitious once again. Technology had advanced so much that Lucas was going to put all of his craziest ideas on the table, and the team behind the movie would have to figure them out. But before the explosion of visual effects could happen for Episode 1, the team needed some kind of testing ground. They needed some kind of proof of concept that this new movie movie's ideas were going to be possible or even accepted. Which is why, in 1996, the team at Lucasfilm and ILM decided, under the stewardship of Rick McCallum, to re-release the original Star Wars trilogy under the banner, The Special Editions. In part to test the new technology, in part because the 20th anniversary of the first movie was coming up, but also because George Lucas always thought the original movies were incomplete. There were effects shots and different moments he had always wanted to fix, and now, after nearly 2 decades, he was finally given the chance to fix them and add to them to create the movies he always wanted to release. All 3 movies were restored digitally, all 3 movies had additional shots filmed that were not part of the originals, and all 3 movies featured new digital visual effects, becoming an elaborate preview of what audiences could expect with the new trilogy. New sequences, redone sequences, all sorts of stuff to polish and fix Lucas's perceived flaws with the original trilogy, all of which led to their re-release on A New Hope's 20th anniversary in 1997.
For an entire generation, people have experienced Star Wars the only way it's been possible, on the TV screen. But if you've only seen it this way, you haven't seen it at all. Now, for its 20th anniversary, the adventure of a lifetime returns to the big screen in a way you've never seen before.
In a flash, Star Wars was back in the pop culture zeitgeist. The movies were coming back to the big screen for the first time in a decade. Trailers were released for the special editions, all 3 movies got brand new posters illustrated by Drew Struzan. It all worked to recapture the magic and excitement audiences had felt 20 years before. And people turned up in droves. On January 31st, Episode 4, A New Hope returned to movie theaters, making a whopping $138 million in North America, making its grand total now $460 million domestically and $775 million worldwide. On February 21st, Empire followed, raking in another $67.6 million in North America. And while Return of the Jedi was initially set to release on March 7th, given the success of the other 2, it was pushed back to March 14th for a little bit of breathing room, making another $45 million across its return run. Star Wars was fully back in the pop culture conversation. The original movie became the most successful movie for the month of February, dominating the box office. It was the perfect return to form for people who hadn't seen them in theaters since they released, or the new generation who hadn't seen them on the big screen at all. The timeless adventure was back and everyone was talking about it. But that didn't mean it was flawless. Well, in a lot of ways it was pretty flawless, but the versions that were released here in 1997 were different from what came out 20 years earlier. The special editions brought along a number of changes, enhanced effects, and additional scenes, some of which were pretty innocuous. I mean, Cloud City now has windows so you can see outside more. The Wampa appears at the start of The Empire Strikes Back in full this time. The puppet they created for the original was pretty bare bones and pretty last minute, but now they could really add that creature into the scene so you could see it in all its glory. For Return of the Jedi, Femi Taylor, who played Oola in the original, was even brought back for a brief additional scene to add tension to the Rancor. That's cool. There were additional shots of other planets at the end of Return of the Jedi during the celebration, with glimpses at Tatooine, Cloud City, and even a huge new metropolis world that people had never seen before. This was Coruscant, which promised to play a big role in the upcoming prequels. And pretty much the entire finale for the original movie was redone with all new effects to create the shots George Lucas had really had in mind. Despite how incredible it originally looked, Lucas always wanted it to be more, and now it was. The Death Star even explodes differently now. But while those changes were totally fine, there were a number of changes that generated a lot more controversy. There was now a big musical number added to the start of Return of the Jedi, expanding on what was there before, with backup singers and 2 CG leads, and boy do they give you a good look into their mouths. Return of the Jedi also featured new celebration music. On top of the new planets, the ending music was changed into something Lucas considered grander and more appropriate for the ultimate conclusion. This unfortunately replaced Yub Nub, which a lot of people really enjoyed. So as much fun as the new music might be, was it worth it to lose Yub Nub? But by far the most controversial aspect came with Mos Eisley in the first movie. I mean, you had new shots to introduce the area, including a big crane shot that unfortunately breaks away from the rest of the movie's visual style. Then you have a new scene featuring Jabba the Hutt, a scene that was filmed and intended to go in the original, but due to time and budget reasons, it got cut. Now it was re-added back into the movie, with a CG Jabba and Han Solo stepping over his tail. I guess it's neat to have this scene now, but it does just repeat all of the same information as the Greedo scene. We're not learning anything new. Oh, but there's Boba Fett. Speaking of the Greedo scene, this is where the real controversy comes in. This is how the scene was put together in the original version of the movie.
Yes, I bet you have.
And now, here's how the scene's cut together in 1997.
Bet you have.
Oh boy, now this one caused a stir. The other changes resulted in sometimes unnecessary additions or unfortunate replacements for certain things, but this one actually changed the intention of a scene. Instead of Han Solo being the no-good scoundrel at the start of the movie, which adds more weight when he turns back at the end, this gives him a slight sense of hesitation so that Greedo shoots first instead. Han waited for his opportunity and only shot after Greedo did. This caused a mountain of controversy within the fandom. Plenty of fans voiced their dislike of the change, constantly using the phrase Han shot first to let everyone know how the scene originally played out. The scene worked fine the way it was, but Lucas didn't see it that way and had it changed. Ultimately, while it was greatly exciting and hugely successful to have the Star Wars trilogy back on the big screen, it changed the fan-creator relationship in a very significant way. Before, fans had their entire faith in George Lucas and the creative team. They made the original trilogy and it ruled. But now they had made changes that weren't always for the better. So the fan reaction now was more, "We know better than you, Mr. Creator." While that side was definitely a bit more fringe right now, it was a pivotal turning point. But audiences at large were still hugely excited, making this a hugely successful advanced preview of the new movies to come. Star Wars was back at the center of the conversation, and now audiences were ready to gear up in just a couple short years for the first all-new movie in almost 2 decades. Throughout the early months of 1997, pre-production on Episode 1 was in full stride. Costumes were being made with far more elegant designs than ever before, sets were being built, full-size props were being made, there were even some mock-ups of the new villainous army, the Battle Droids, the precursors to the Stormtroopers in a lot of ways. Even Spielberg showed up to have a look around, voicing his confidence.
That's great.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be great.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be great.
And then came the biggest workload for the movie, the visual effects. Episode 1 was set to have more digital visual effects shots than any contemporary movie. Most big movies at the time landed somewhere around 200, maybe 250 shots. If you were feeling real ambitious like James Cameron was for Titanic, you might land at 500 shots. But Episode 1 was going to feature nearly 2,000 visual effects shots across its runtime, a workload that no other studio at the time was ready for. But Lucas and Rick McCallum had faith that the team at ILM would be able to pull it off. A team featuring some big names up top. You had John Knoll, Dennis Muren, and Scott Squires as the 3 visual effects supervisors, Jeff Olson joined as a visual effects producer, and Rob Coleman joined as the animation director. This became a huge technological leap, because George Lucas had plenty of ideas that had never been attempted before, and the team had to find a way to figure them out.
The big grass planet battle there, the zillions of creatures.
we don't have a real good way of doing that right now.
One of the big technological leaps was in the area of pre-visualization. For a lot of film history, and even for a lot of this movie, shots were conceptualized through drawings, storyboards. Someone with a pencil and paper would draw out what the shot was going to be. But as useful as storyboards are, you never get a real sense of momentum, pace, or even complicated camera movements. And there was one sequence in particular where knowing that stuff was going to be absolutely essential. The pod race. A scene so intricate and intense that it couldn't just be dreamt up as drawings on paper, it needed something more. Which meant that for the first time in film history, a sequence was pre-visualized with 3D animation to sculpt and design the entire thing. To figure out every shot, every moment, all to help the filmmakers create what they wanted to be a breathtaking sequence. Exciting stuff. You know what else is exciting? Casting. The cast of the original movies were an integral part of their success. You don't get the roguish charm of Han Solo without Harrison Ford. So now, with a new trilogy and new story, a whole new band of actors were assembled to follow in the footsteps of what came before, and also cement themselves as their own characters within this universe. Ewan McGregor, who'd previously starred in Trainspotting, was cast as the young Obi-Wan Kenobi, long before his adventures as old Ben Kenobi in the first movie. Crazily enough, Ewan McGregor actually had a connection to Star Wars already, as his uncle Dennis Lawson played Wedge Antilles in the originals. Now that's cool. Liam Neeson joined as Obi-Wan's master, Qui-Gon Jinn. Natalie Portman joined as Padme. Ian McDiarmid was back from Return of the Jedi, here to play a young version of the Emperor before he became the Emperor. He was joined by Ray Park as the film's new villain, Darth Maul. Ray Park, of course, was a martial artist and sword fighter, able to bring that expertise to the fight sequences to make them more exciting than ever. At the same time, Samuel L. Jackson had revealed on a radio show that he was a big fan of the original movies and would love to be a part of the new ones in any capacity. This eventually made its way back to Lucasfilm, for which they approached him asking if he was serious about joining. And he was. And so Samuel L. Jackson joined as one of the members of the Jedi Council, Mace Windu, during their prime years before the rise of the Empire. He'd be sitting side by side with Yoda, who would once again be voiced and puppeteered by Frank Oz. And of course, Anthony Daniels and Kenny Baker were back as C-3PO and R2-D2 respectively, promising to be the only two actors that'd be present for all 6 movies. Once the saga was complete, it didn't matter where you went, you'd still be greeted with the 2 droids that started it all. But there were 2 other characters that had their own unique challenges. On one side, Ahmed Best joined as the most overt comic relief character the series has ever seen, Jar Jar Binks. But he wouldn't just be comic relief, he'd also be created primarily with CGI. For one of the first times, a CG character was going to have a starring role alongside his live-action counterparts, with initial plans to have Ahmed Best in partial costume that'd be given a digital head replacement to create the finalized look. And then came the hardest role to cast by a long shot, Anakin Skywalker, the young Darth Vader himself, who in this movie was going to be portrayed as just 9 years old. The casting process was immense. Casting a child actor is really tough. Finding a child actor that would work is really tough. Over the casting process, there were around 3,000 kids interviewed for the part of Anakin. That pool eventually narrowed down more and more until finally landing on the one kid that'd take the franchise away, 8-year-old Jake Lloyd. With him joining the cast, the main ensemble was complete. The central cast of the next Star Wars movie was now in place, and excitement only built up for the day production would begin. The budget was set for a whopping $115 million this time, which is far and away the biggest budget for any of these movies. Partly thanks to inflation. Gotta love that stuff. And following in the footsteps of Return of the Jedi, Episode 1 began shooting under a working title to hide itself at least a little bit from the outside world. This time it was all under the pseudonym The Dollhouse. But it's also worth noting that expectations for this movie behind the scenes were much different than they were last time, specifically around the man himself, George Lucas. On the first movie, George Lucas was just another filmmaker. He had a successful hit with American Graffiti, which made some actors eager to work with him, but outside of that, he was just a filmmaker with a hugely ambitious dream. But this time, perception of him was much different. He was the creator of Star Wars, the greatest adventure the world had ever seen, and now he's back in that universe again to tell new stories. So, the cast and crew alike were riding into production on faith that Lucas would be able to wow audiences again just like he had 20 years before. Wanna catch lightning in a bottle a second time? Good thing you have the guy that did it the first time. All of which led to June 26, 1997, the first day of principal photography on Episode 1. Production took place in a bunch of different places, but it was primarily conducted in Leavesden Studios in England, a large building where the crew would work closed off from the outside world in a controlled environment. One goal Lucas had following the original trilogy was to make filmmaking easier. The original movies were nightmares to put together, especially on set, with troubles plaguing almost every aspect. So the process became not just for Episode 1, but the entire new trilogy to find a way to make everything far easier and more reliable on set. More shooting on stages, heavier use of blue screens, a lot more controlled environments. George Lucas even wanted to transition to filming with digital cameras, but the manufacturers he was looking into wouldn't have the cameras ready in time. So, like the originals, Episode 1 was once again shot on film. This is only where the process began for making filmmaking easier. This was merely the first step that'd take the entire trilogy to fully work out, which is why Episode 1 still had a bevy of location shooting throughout its production. Filming was conducted at Castlebury Park in Watford, Hertfordshire. The crew journeyed to the Caserta Palace in Italy, which doubled for Theed Palace on the new world of Naboo. And of course, the movie was going to return to the desert planet of Tatooine, so the crew returned to the desert of Tunisia, the same country Lucas had filmed in 20 years before. This time they built a massive town set outside of the city of Tozur, a huge living and breathing location bustling with crazy space aliens and new creatures. But as is to be expected with location shooting, especially for George Lucas, problems inevitably arose. At the end of July, while filming in Tunisia, a huge storm raged over the area, with lightning strikes and huge winds rushing over. The next morning, once the storm had subsided, the crew found the set and the props for the pod race almost entirely destroyed. Fortunately, George Lucas himself was pretty calm and collected about all of this, and the team got back to work to rework the schedule and repair what had been damaged.
I say it's good luck.
It is good luck.
It happened last time and it happened this time. Almost, it's like reliving it.
That wasn't the only production mishap though, as there were more general things like the R2-D2 prop not working the best. Kenny Baker would still be the pilot for some R2-D2 props, but others were going to be driven remotely, almost like a real droid. Almost. But the props weren't the best at terrain, door lifts, that kind of stuff. So two separate teams worked on two different R2-D2 props that could handle what this movie needed, all to make them far more seamless with the larger production. There were still misadventures and challenges along the way, but there were also big, exciting moments, like the filming of a climactic lightsaber duel. George Lucas stressed the notion that this movie was set during the golden age of the Jedi, and as a result, the lightsaber fight here would be leagues beyond what was seen in the originals. All of which was choreographed by Nick Gillard, who worked with the actors involved to create the fastest, most intense sequence he could. And Ray Park, who plays the mysterious villain, was a great help given his fighting and martial arts background. And the actors trained for months to hone in on the exact movements and choreography that'd make the fight. Then you had the technological advances during shooting. As mentioned, the initial plans for Jar Jar Binks were to simply replace his head with CG, leaving the body as it was on set. But after doing some early tests and rendering out the character in different ways, it was discovered that it was easier to replace Ahmed Best entirely with CGI, while still using the on-set suit for lighting and performance reference to make it look as real as possible. And ultimately, filming on Episode 1 came to a close on September 30th, 1997. After a few months across the world, the cast and crew finally wrapped production on the very beginning of the Star Wars saga, which dovetailed right into 1998. where this movie would face an exceptionally long post-production timeline. The movie was going to have nearly 2 years devoted to just post-production to get the huge effects pipeline through the door and into movie theaters. The visual effects work on this movie was leagues beyond what any other movie had attempted. The team at ILM was going to create enormous sequences that were going to make entirely CG landscapes and areas, and building off of the discovery made during production that Jar Jar would be entirely CGI, Ahmed Best was brought back to the motion capture stage to record his movements for the character during post, meaning that for the first time an entirely CG character was created with use of motion capture. It wasn't all digital, however. Some of the things Lucas wanted for the movie still weren't entirely achievable through digital effects. While backgrounds were created for the pod race sequence, the rest of the movie featured a lot of models for backdrops. From big to small, there were tons of physical models that would then be digitally composited into the sequences. The movie's editing also made big strides. This time around, the movie was edited by Paul Martin Smith and Ben Burtt. Ben Burtt, of course, was the lead sound designer on the original trilogy, creating some of the most iconic sounds in film history. Now, he'd be instrumental in editing the new chapter George Lucas had in mind, and thanks to the evolution of digital non-linear editing, they could do absolutely crazy things. In the past, whenever you didn't like one thing in a particular take, you throw the whole thing out. It's a bad take, get rid of it. But now, Lucas was able to mix and match different takes together. If you like this part from take 2 and that part from take 5, do a bit of trickery and combine them to make the ultimate shot as good as it could be. The power of digital editing, the power of unlimited potential, exactly what George Lucas was after. The huge post-production process continued all throughout the year, with visual effects, sound, and editing coming together in time for the rough cut, a stage in post-production where the entire creative leadership behind the movie got together and watched it front to back. For the first time, with the movie assembled, they'd all see it played down. Unfortunately, the rough cut was not the greatest. Now, it's not uncommon for rough cuts to be disastrous, but it is interesting to see the faces of the key creatives behind the movie all in a bit of disbelief of what they've seen, with big questions being raised about the editing and story decisions, particularly around the finale.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Luckily, this was just the rough cut, and in one of George Lucas's better financial decisions, he decided to allocate some of the budget towards a period of reshoots. On the original movies, it wasn't uncommon for the crew to go back and redo scenes if they weren't working. Unfortunately, that did balloon the budget and extend the shooting schedule in ways that weren't anticipated. So, knowing that that was a likely possibility, reshoots were built in for the plans around Episode 1 from the very beginning. And starting in August of 1998, Lucas returned to set to film bits and pieces of the movie to help round it out and make it better. Meanwhile, on the outside, the fan base was watching intently to gather any information they could about the new movie. They could not be more excited. The clock was ticking by day, with every minute, every hour that went by, the next brand new Star Wars movie ticked closer and closer. The fanbase had many questions about what the storyline could be, how the characters would interact, how it would set up the entire trilogy, but the biggest question for fans was by far, what's it going to be called? Internally at Lucasfilm, the movie was simply referred to as The Beginning. But that's not really gonna work, is it? You gotta have something a bit more extravagant than The Beginning. Thankfully, there was something a bit more extravagant, because on September 25th, 1998, fans around the world were greeted with the first big announcement for the new movie. It was going to be called Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. And the fan base responded with a resounding, "What? That's an odd title. It doesn't sound quite the same as something like Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi." Polls were held online, and while some people had faith in George Lucas and believed it would all ultimately work out, others were more concerned. It didn't sound quite right. But any fears created by the title were soon squashed, as it was only the first piece of news of many. Because 2 months later, in November of 1998, the Star Wars fanbase was brought together as one for the immensely exciting release of the very first teaser trailer for Episode 1. On November 17th, playing in theaters in front of the movie Meet Joe Black, people could lay their eyes on the very first official footage from The Phantom Menace. It was so exciting, in fact, that people would go to the theater only for the Phantom Menace trailer. They'd show up, buy their ticket for Meet Joe Black, watch the trailer, and then leave. That was it. At the same time, the trailer was available for download on StarWars.com. Spending the entire day on dial-up internet, fans around the world would download the trailer just to see it in all of its 5 glorious pixels. And initial reactions to the trailer were absolutely stellar. People walking out of the theater or watching it on repeat at home were blown away. And that's because the trailer's incredible. Across 2 minutes, this trailer packs a wallop. Big, exciting sequences, looks at new and familiar characters, the meeting of Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, alongside teases towards the ultimate fate of the young boy and the threat of the dark side. Which was even complemented by this poster, showing young Anakin Skywalker in front of the old homestead with his shadow taking the form of Darth Vader. The whole trailer was complete with the opening taglines, "Every generation has a legend. Every journey has a first step. Every saga has a beginning." And whoa, that guy's got a double-bladed lightsaber. Dude, are you seeing this? That lightsaber battle's gonna be unreal. There was nothing more exciting right now than the release of the Phantom Menace trailer, and with it opening up to further screenings playing in front of The Waterboy, The Siege, and A Bug's Life, it became the go-to trailer for all moviegoers. It was equally, if not more exciting to see this trailer as it was to see the movies it was playing in front of. And the internet downloads broke records, with 1 million downloads recorded in the first 24 hours of the trailer's release, the most downloads for any movie trailer ever. Any fears about the title were long washed to the past. The Phantom Menace looked amazing, and there was only a few months left before it would storm into theaters and restart the Star Wars journey for the entire world. One of the best parts of the original movies, if not the single greatest aspect, was the music. Across all 3 movies, John Williams absolutely killed it, which is why it was a no-brainer to bring him back for the new movies. In February of 1999, recording finally began at Abbey Road Studios for John Williams' brilliant new score. Since this movie was set several decades before the originals, the decision was made to create a whole bunch of new tracks to separate this trilogy from the first. There would be some themes worked in from the originals, but this era would be dominated by a whole new sound. Particularly, the score this time would work a lot more with a choir, vocals, a chorus, all to help elevate the music to a more mystical and ethereal place, which became the central focus of the most iconic piece of music, Duel of the Fates, which would be used for the climactic lightsaber duel. Once again, just like the previous movies, John Williams' score was able to exceed expectations, and even among fans patiently or even impatiently waiting for the new movie, the music was going to be one of the most exciting aspects.
1, 2, sing.
And as the months ticked by and Phantom Menace came closer and closer, the marketing really began to heat up. While there had been a trailer released so far, things were soon about to explode. Fans were greeted by an all-new theatrical poster, with artwork by Drew Struzan revealing the cast of characters in a breathtaking new image. And on March 12, 1999, playing in front of the movie Wing Commander, 20th Century Fox and Lucasfilm debuted the second full trailer for The Phantom Menace.
Will not condone a course of action that will lead us to war.
Across another 2 minutes, this trailer is the greatest look yet at the story this new movie's going to tell, revealing that a droid force is invading the peaceful world of Naboo, and our heroes must team up with the people on the surface to fight back, eventually roping in the one and only Anakin Skywalker to become a larger part of the ongoing adventure. The details of how it was all going to fit together were still up for debate, but this trailer was the best look anyone had into what George Lucas had cooked up for the first of this new trilogy.
Wipe them out. All of them.
But if you thought the promotion for Phantom Menace was crazy so far, oh boy, you're in for a wild ride. Because on the last push before Episode 1's May 19th release, this movie took over. The real lucrative corner of promotion came with toys and merchandising, building off of the original trilogy, which had excelled in this area. Although the distribution of toy rights was quite different this time. Before, Kenner had sole rights to create and distribute Star Wars toys, and George Lucas was only able to gain 2.5% of revenue generated by toy sales, something he wasn't that happy with. But after the conclusion of the original trilogy, Kenner became significantly less profitable. They were eventually bought out by Tonka, who were then eventually bought out by Hasbro. But bigger than that, in order to maintain the rights to Star Wars toys in perpetuity, it was written into their contract that they had to pay $10,000 a year to George Lucas, either via the profits they had made or via a simple check. But for one reason or another, they didn't do that. Suddenly, the contract was voided, and Lucas swiftly reclaimed all toy rights for Star Wars, able to distribute them as he pleased. George Lucas went everywhere for The Phantom Menace, partnering with tons of venues and licensors to plaster Episode 1 on anything humanly possible. Of course, Hasbro would eventually get a piece of the pie, becoming one of the biggest partners for Phantom Menace toys, but considering Lucas's far stronger negotiating stance, he was able to strike a significantly better deal for himself. Instead of making 2.5% off of toy sales like before, he'd now take home 18% of all toy sales. A historic deal. George Lucas made out like a bandit because of this, in a deal that has humorously been referred to as George's Revenge. Thanks to this, The Phantom Menace launched into stores through 1999. You could actually call it an invasion, just like the one those droids were doing in the trailer. You had legions of toys and action figures, you had food like candies, chocolates, and even a Jar Jar tongue candy, which I'm sure some people were big fans of. 2 video games were made in conjunction with the movie. You had the film adaptation itself, also titled The Phantom Menace, and then you had Episode 1 Racer, which allowed you to take part in speedy pod races just like the one seen in the movie. Then came the 2 most lucrative deals. The first with Pepsi, who put forward a whopping $2 billion to sponsor both Phantom Menace and its 2 eventual sequels, which had now been confirmed to arrive in 2002 and 2005 respectively, which was one of the biggest licensing deals in entertainment history. And then of course, Star Wars made a deal with Lego. For the first time, Lego tried their hand at licensing to create new themed sets centering around the galaxy far, far away. At first, early in 1999, they released sets based on the original trilogy. X-Wings, TIE Fighters, you name it. But then, as Phantom Menace's release drew nearer, Lego expanded to making sets of anything and everything that had appeared in the movie. This was the beginning of a long-standing partnership between the 2 companies, with Lego continuously making bigger and better sets around some of the most iconic Star Wars vehicles and ideas. The Phantom Menace was bigger than anything else in the world. You couldn't go 2 feet without seeing Episode 1 written on something, anything, out on the street. In fact, given the immense amount of hype, the official Star Wars fan club hosted the very first Star Wars celebration in Denver, Colorado. Running from April 30th to May 2nd, this brought together over 20,000 Star Wars fans in their collective love of Star Wars and their unwieldy excitement for the franchise's grand return. Excitement for this movie was on a level that had never been seen before. Everyone around the world knew The Phantom Menace was coming, and so many people were lined up in droves to be the first to see it for themselves. Which meant the box office prospects were absolutely immense. If any movie could dethrone Titanic as the biggest movie of all time, it was this. People were lined up to get tickets for days before the release. They were lined up in droves to get in for the midnight launch. People took time off work, they called in sick, they skipped school. It was an event unlike any other.
I've been waiting 15 years since Return of the Jedi came out to see the prequel.
There's no way it's going to be a disappointment.
Are there any of you that think this is going to be a lousy movie? No!
Premiere events across the country brought fans together under one collective umbrella. Star Wars fans were reunited around the world to see what George Lucas had in store for them. And finally, after 16 years since the release of Return of the Jedi, after 5 years since Lucas announced his plan to create an all-new trilogy, it was time for the journey to begin again. The clock had now turned to May 19th, 1999. So grab your seats, get out your popcorn, Pepsi, and lightsabers, because the day has finally arrived. We're about to watch Episode 1. Turmoil has engulfed the Galactic Republic. The taxation of trade routes to outlying star systems is in dispute. That doesn't sound right. But that's just the crawl. It might be overloaded with seemingly superfluous political details, but it's just the crawl. We then tilt down to the opening scene, in which our main characters slowly dock their ship inside of a Trade Federation blockade hangar. There's something off about this.
I have a bad feeling about this.
Yeah, you said it. The opening crawl has always been a staple of Star Wars, the punchy opening number to thrust us into the opening scene with purpose. And while this does give context for the scene we're about to jump into, it doesn't do so with excitement and verve, it does so mathematically, algorithmically to a certain extent. But I'm getting ahead of myself, surely. We've only just started. There's plenty more movie to go, right? This movie sees the Trade Federation attempt to invade the peaceful world of Naboo and force Queen Amidala, the planet's ruler, to sign a treaty to make it legal. Now, 2 Jedi, Qui-Gon Jinn and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi, who were originally sent to negotiate with the Federation, are now tasked with protecting the Queen and getting her back to the capital world of the Republic, Coruscant, so that they can fight back against the invasion and stop the Trade Federation. Along the way, they arrive on Tatooine, running into a young Anakin Skywalker, who changes their fate in a huge way as the story of the saga kicks off. But unfortunately, the movie leaps through some of these developments at a breakneck pace. It's moving so fast it's hard to keep up. We start with the negotiations, then there's a bit of action against droids, we journey to the planet below, we see an underwater city, there's a whole scene of our heroes evading giant fish.
There's always a bigger fish.
There are more droid clashes, and then there's an escape from Naboo by breaking through the Trade Federation's blockade. And all of that happens in the first 30 minutes of the movie. It feels clear that the movie's trying to show off its technical prowess and creative ideas as soon as possible, but it's ultimately quite tonally uneven. Any one of these ideas could be expanded far more and potentially become a real and true part of the story. As it stands, it sometimes feels like I'm watching a tech demo. It's moving really fast, which gives this feeling of whiplash as each scene transitions to the next. And that also makes the later stretches of the movie all the more jarring because once the characters leave Naboo, the pace slows right the hell down. A very big section of the movie takes place on Coruscant, and it is very slow. The movie's introducing a bunch of ideas. It's interesting to see the Republic in its prime before the eventual formation of the Empire, and it's interesting that the movie's getting into how this institution isn't the best. With a big ol' vote of no confidence given to Chancellor Valorum. That's big. But as interesting as it might be to parse these ideas and put together the current state of the galaxy, it's not as entertaining to watch. There's gotta be a better way to get across these ideas than to tune into intergalactic C-SPAN.
Will you defer your motion to allow a commission to explore the validity of your accusations?
Despite hopes coming out of the strange opening crawl, it is unfortunate to say that The Phantom Menace is not as good as its predecessors. It's choppier, it's both faster and slower at the same time. Every character has the personality of a plank of wood. Even when they're put together, it's just a bunch of planks of wood talking to each other. It's not about making a movie that emulates the originals in every way, because the new stuff this movie attempts is far more interesting than a rehash would be, but it is about missing the core storytelling conceits that made the originals function and work as well as they do.
Coruscant, that doesn't compute. Wait, you're under arrest.
With George Lucas back in the director's chair, this movie visually takes a lot more cues from the first movie than it does the other two. Once again, the camera's locked off on a tripod most of the time, with occasional pans and tilts here and there. Everything is once again captured with objective framing, the camera simply observing events, never becoming a character in its own right, by design. But as a result, despite this style working on the first movie, it is a lot more dull here. It's mostly down to personal preference, but I can't help but get antsy watching as the movie repeats the same framing and same shot choices the whole way through. Every establishing shot in this movie feels identical. Every conversation is shot in a similar way. Once the camera does move, which it does sometimes during dialogue scenes, it feels like a breath of fresh air.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Design-wise, everything feels really clean this time. Maybe a little too clean. I think I really prefer the grime and dirt that was all over the designs in the original movies. Part of what made them so special at the time was that they took space fantasy and made it just as dirty and detailed as the real world. It's entirely admirable, however, that this movie wanted to do something different. They wanted to create a new world. What did Star Wars look like before the Empire? This is the answer, and for that it's commendable. But it's also less interesting to look at in some ways. What really weighs this movie down, though, as mentioned, are the characters. Characters are the heart and soul of stories, especially big traditional crowd pleasers like Star Wars. The original trilogy excelled at characters, and it's exactly why people fell in love so quickly. They wanted to rush away with Luke, become a scoundrel like Han, and were inspired by Leia. Smartly, the choice is made here to create a new batch of characters that feel very different from the trio we got last time. But the bigger question is, who are these new characters? Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan are Jedi, and they're quite stoic. They're monotone, they deliver every line about the same, with a lot of formality in the dialogue. The two of them are very similar as characters. The biggest difference is that Qui-Gon is a gambling addict and Obi-Wan complains all the time.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
Anakin Skywalker is the young boy version of Darth Vader, of course, from before he's Vader. He's young, he's excitable, I guess. He likes ships, he likes fixing things, so he's got that going for him. And ultimately, I think Jake Lloyd is doing his damnedest with the material he's given, but it would take an incredibly skilled actor to sell the line.
Are you an angel? What?
Padme is also very monotone, very formal in her speech. Initially, she's believed to be one of the Queen's handmaidens, but eventually it's revealed that she's actually the Queen herself. She's Queen Padme Amidala. A reveal that makes her even more monotone than before. For whatever reason, she's doing a deeper voice to make herself sound more imposing, I guess? It's very strange. There is a bright spot here with Senator Palpatine. Once again, Ian McDiarmid is great. While there are fewer opportunities for him to chew the scenery like last time, he does still steal every tiny little look and glance to sell you on his secret evil nature.
We will watch your career with great interest.
Then you have the Jedi Council, another interesting idea. We see Jedi in their prime long before their collapse prior to the original trilogy. But they kind of suck. For one thing, they're also very monotone, very dull. I mean, even Yoda, the greatest character of all time, is somehow boring in this movie. How does that happen? I guess they went all in on the idea that he was testing Luke before, and that's why he was acting crazy. But I don't know, I really liked when Yoda was a crazy little guy.
I'm looking for someone.
Looking? Found someone you have, I would say.
Right.
But then there's also the idea that the movie seems to be presenting them as an entirely noble group with their own code of ethics. But the code itself seems like an afterthought and strange. Like you can't train two people at once, but why? Also, the Jedi Council decides that Anakin won't be trained because, let's see here. Right, he's too old.
He's too old.
It made sense when Yoda said it in Empire because at that point Luke was like 20, but this kid's 9. What, do you have to pick him off the shelf when they're still an embryo? I don't understand. Maybe this is just a subtle hint towards the idea that they might be child traffickers. The expansion of the Jedi also brings with it two very big decisions that I personally can't get behind. Firstly, it's revealed that Anakin Skywalker is the Chosen One.
You refer to the prophecy of the one who will bring balance to the Force. You believe it's this boy?
This movie introduces a prophecy that one day a vergence in the Force will become destined to bring balance between light and dark. And apparently, good old Shmi Skywalker, Anakin's mother, just became pregnant one day. The Force decided that she would be pregnant, and that's how we got Anakin Skywalker. Meaning he is destined to bring balance to the Force. The intention being that he ultimately does at the end of Return of the Jedi by redeeming himself and throwing the Emperor off the ledge. Anakin Skywalker, Darth Vader, is Space Jesus. But I can't help but think that making Darth Vader the Chosen One absolutely cheapens that moment. Because now it's destined to be this way. It's by the will of the Force that everything worked out, not a genuine character choice that he made in the heat of the moment. I don't like Chosen One stories to begin with. They're so often a cheat code to easily explain why someone is special, and almost never do they get into how it can negatively impact the supposed Chosen One. Instead of putting in the work to make a character special, the Chosen One idea instantly makes them special through divine intervention, and I think that's kinda lame. Anakin Skywalker's story could work so much better if he's just a boy picked up by the Jedi and ultimately falls from grace. He doesn't need to be Space Jesus. The other thing that I can't really get behind is that this movie felt the need to explain the Force. Yoda and Obi-Wan put it perfectly in the other movies. The Force is an energy field that you can tap into with enough time and patience.
Life creates it. Makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us and binds us.
But this movie says that the Force is actually a collection of microscopic organisms called midi-chlorians, and that the more midi-chlorians you have, the better you'll be at the Force. The Force is not something that needs to be explained like this. Everyone got it the first time. I don't need to know that it's actually a bunch of space germs that make it so that people can lift things with their mind. Now it's significantly less special. It takes something deeply baked in fantasy and turns it into a science. Now, the only way to be good with the Force is not through time and patience, it's if you have enough of the space germs. But it is very funny to imagine the idea that this isn't the first time Qui-Gon's brought a kid to the council thinking he's the chosen one. It's like, bro, this is the 7th kid you brought here. No, but I think I really have it this time. This kid's got enough of the germ. That's very amusing to me. But then you get the most infamous and easily the most controversial character in this movie, Jar Jar Binks. Clearly the comic relief, but comic relief designed exclusively for kids. He's loud, he's frantic, he's clumsy, all the things that'll get kids hooting and hollering, but all the stuff that becomes grating to adults. As a result, a lot of people hated this character. He was considered incredibly annoying, over-the-top, childish. His function within the ensemble, as well as the fans' reaction to him, was like the Ewoks on overdrive. However, it's worth noting that Jar Jar is the only character here with any personality. He's the only one running around who isn't monotone or dull. He's got life to him, and sometimes that becomes a bright spot in the sea of monks sitting around in chairs talking about nothing. The characters in this movie are very, very ill-defined, and it's not helped that they don't get any clever or fun interactions with one another. There's never really any bickering. Almost all of the dialogue in this movie is plot-focused. This is what we gotta do, and now we're gonna go do it. There's never any internalized thoughts, never anything deeper going on than that. What do these characters think of each other? What does Obi-Wan think of Anakin? What does Anakin think of Obi-Wan? I don't know, they barely interact. At the same time, the characters don't seem all that stressed about, well, anything, really. Everyone is very cool and collected. Whenever an action sequence is about to kick off, the characters will often reassure you and others that it's gonna be just fine.
There are too many of them.
It won't be a problem.
The difficulty is getting into the throne room. Once we're inside, we shouldn't have a problem.
The thing is, they're often right. A lot of the action here is just Jedi cutting down the ineffective and weak battle droids. It doesn't take anything on their part to take them down. So while it does look cool when the Jedi swing around their lightsabers and cut down droids, I'm not all that invested, because things aren't all that exciting when they're easy. At the same time, once the movie takes a turn to Tatooine, it's discovered that the planet is run off of slave labor. Or at least Anakin and his mother Shmi are slaves of Watto. But that doesn't become the central focus of the movie. It makes you wonder, what could this movie be if it was about the liberation of Tatooine? Could that have been an effective story? Maybe. We'll never truly know.
I didn't actually come here to free slaves.
But the real kicker is the choices the characters make. On Tatooine, Qui-Gon gets wrapped up in a big gamble with Watto. Watto has the parts they need to get where they need to go. He claims to be the only person around who has those parts, and our heroes don't have the right currency to pay him. So Qui-Gon bets the ship on Anakin winning a big pod race, and then eventually changes the bet slightly by adding Anakin's freedom to his wager. But why not try and find a currency exchange? There might be one of those around. Maybe check with other shops to see if someone else has the parts and is willing to exchange them for Republic credits. Maybe sell the ship and get a new one. Even if there was just one scene where our characters looked around a little bit more, found that Watto was the only one with these parts, that there was no other way, this would work so much better. As it stands, it just feels like Qui-Gon got duped by the oldest sales trick in the book.
And no one else has a T-14 hyperdrive, I promise you that!
Thankfully, once the pivotal pod race finally comes around, it is absolutely incredible, and that's in part because it's set up to be difficult. Characters are always talking about how it's scary. Shmi doesn't want Anakin to race, she thinks it's too dangerous. We reveal that Anakin's never actually finished a race. Qui-Gon's betting the farm, Sebulba is sabotaging everything. It could be better and use some more tact, but it's just enough to set up the stakes of the race and make it feel more intense. Then you get the sequence itself. A greatly riveting, technologically impressive sequence where all of these pods are racing at 500 miles an hour. They're blasting through. It's like the speeder chase in Return of the Jedi, but on a whole new level. The pods are moving at wicked speed, challenges and trials are hitting Anakin left and right, and the sound is fantastic. And as the scene builds to the climax, the music kicks in and raises the tension to peak levels right before Anakin's eventual victory. There are beats and reversals, an antagonist we want to see get defeated, and stakes behind it so we know that if things go wrong, they'll really go wrong. Which all leads to the final bit where in a moment of catharsis and satisfaction, Anakin finally bests Sebulba and wins the race. It's easily one of the biggest highlights of the movie, and the centerpiece of the entire thing. Just like the music. Once again, John Williams killed it with the score. You got a handful of returning themes, some of them even given slightly new renditions. And then you have a bunch of new themes. There are new big action tracks that are fun and energetic. There are smaller character themes like one for Qui-Gon, which is understated but used at just the right moments to be effective. And then there's Anakin's theme. A very light, very breezy theme, bustling with innocence. But as foreshadowing for the dark turn to come, the Imperial March is worked into it, further cementing that as Vader's theme, providing a hint towards Anakin's dark future. But before we get to Anakin's dark future, we also have to reveal that he built C-3PO. So whenever C-3PO was saying thank the maker in the originals, he was talking about Darth Vader. Not sure if that was a necessary detail, but whatever way to get R2 and 3PO into every movie, am I right? And all of this leads to the grand finale, which is even bigger than all of the other finales in the previous movies. A New Hope had one finale, Empire had two, Jedi had three, and now Phantom Menace has 4 simultaneous finales. It feels a little bit overwhelming. There are so many threads to keep track of, so much stuff going on that it's easy to miss something or lose track. On one side, Padme and the Naboo guards enter Theed Palace to try and capture Newt Gunray. This is probably the least interesting side. It's just guys shooting droids, a bit of grapple action, some slight trickery, and that's about it. Not much to it. There's a big army versus army clash between the Gungans and the battle droids, which is impressive on a technical level because no one had ever done anything that big in computers before. It was the first of its class. It does feel very tonally disconnected from the other finales though, since it is heavily leaning into Jar Jar's sense of humor and the crazy antics he and the other Gungans can get up to. but it does function fairly well on a story level. There are reversals, there are big pendulum swings. The Gungans at first have the upper hand with this big shield. The Trade Federation can't penetrate it, until they send in a bunch of droids and everything goes right to hell. So, despite the tonal inconsistency with the other finales, it provides a lot of clarity when it comes to the beats of the action. I also quite like those blue ball things that melt the droids. Those are fun. The most visually impressive finale comes with the space battle, as Anakin flies around the Trade Federation command ship to destroy it. The setup is kinda crazy though, because after Anakin's rejection by the Council, Qui-Gon decides it's a good idea to bring him to a war zone. Sounds very responsible. But once the action heats up, it's very exciting. The camera's finally moving again, soaring around the area. The effects are impressive, both CG and model work, which are used in tandem here. But it's also quite clear that this is trying to emulate the finale of A New Hope. Just like Luke, Anakin is here to destroy the villain's ultimate weapon and save the day. But don't just take it from me, take it from the man himself.
Instead of destroying the Death Star, he destroys the ship that controls the robots. Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme, every stanza kind of rhymes with the last one. Hopefully it'll work.
There's just one little thing. In A New Hope, the destruction of the Death Star specifically hitting the exhaust port is the entire point of the sequence. That was their plan from the get-go. We understand it before the sequence starts, we see a couple of runs before Luke finally makes his approach, and in a final moment, he makes a big character decision, Han Solo makes a startling comeback, and all of that comes through for the big moment of elation as the Death Star is finally destroyed. It's just working setups and payoffs the whole time, and everything comes together for the big bang. Conversely, here in The Phantom Menace, Anakin accidentally flies into the Trade Federation ship, and in an attempt to escape, fires some torpedoes, which happen to hit a key part of the command ship, causing a chain reaction that destroys it. It just doesn't hit as hard when every beat is presented as a happy accident. It's not about recapturing the moment in its entirety or about feeling like a kid again, it's about using the storytelling tricks, the art of setup and payoff to make the whole thing come to life. As it stands, it looks cool and the music definitely hits, but this explosion is not nearly as big of a deal as the Death Stars.
Now this is pod racing.
Kid's got a point on that one though, I gotta give him that. But then comes the fourth and no doubt best side of the finale, the lightsaber duel. George Lucas promised that this movie would see the Jedi in their prime, fighting better than ever, and this sequence definitely delivers. Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are mounting up against Darth Maul, who wields a double-bladed lightsaber. I mean, the choreography is very stylized, but it's also fast and flashy. The three of them are constantly trying to outmatch each other. The actors are giving it their all, moving fast and with wicked speed. It is very funny watching them spin all the time, just giving their opponent ample opportunity to stab them in the back, but it's still fun. There are even good moments like Obi-Wan psyching out Maul briefly to distract him. However, there's nothing going on between the characters. I know there's the idea that this is ultimately the duel for the fate of Anakin. You know, whoever makes it out of this will ultimately train him. Will it be the father figure or the older brother figure? But that's not really on screen. Anakin and Obi-Wan only interact once before this, so I don't know if him becoming the master would be good or bad. And I don't know what any of the characters think of each other. What do Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan think about Darth Maul? They're interested that he's a Sith, but that's about it. That also means they should probably be going in to capture Maul and question him, but never do they inquire about where he's come from or what he's doing. They just fight. They don't have any emotional reason to take Maul down. So I, as an audience member, have no reason to care beyond the fact that I like seeing the lightsabers fly around. Thankfully, things do finally heat up once the battle takes one tragic turn. Now there is something here between the characters. Darth Maul just killed Qui-Gon, and Obi-Wan is pissed. Suddenly, when the fight starts again, you feel the intensity so much more. It feels so much more personal. It happens right at the end, but once the personal aspect is added to the scene, it becomes far more engaging, and ultimately leads to Obi-Wan getting the upper hand and defeating Maul once and for all. Good work, Obi-Wan. Unfortunately, Qui-Gon's dead though, so I guess Anakin's gotta be trained by the older brother figure, not the father figure. Sad. Ultimately, Naboo is freed from the Trade Federation, Valorum gets the boot as Palpatine succeeds him to become Chancellor, one step closer to his ultimate reign, and now Obi-Wan is going to train Anakin as a promise to Qui-Gon. The Jedi Council turned around on that, by the way. They decided Anakin should be trained. Would have been cool to see that decision get made, but that's alright. And ultimately, the whole thing closes out with a big celebration sequence. Both sides of Naboo, the surface dwellers and the Gungans, sign a treaty for peace, and the movie closes out like all the others with an iris wipe. Man, that wasn't as good as the others, was it? The Phantom Menace presents a lot of interesting ideas, lots of technical innovations and upgrades with some of the most impressive effects for the time. It's a movie that I have a great time thinking about and parsing its ideas, but whenever I have it actually playing in front of me, I'm bored. I admire its ambition and ideas more than I enjoy actually watching it. Video footage from initial reactions, however, told a different story. People walking out of the theater were totally jazzed about the whole thing.
Fantastic. Go see it as quick as you can.
It was better than all.
I think the lightsaber battles were the greatest.
It was good, dude. It was really good.
So worth it. So worth it.
There was praise for the action and spectacle. Everyone was generally riding off the high of a new Star Wars movie in theaters and the action-packed finale. And the box office reception did not disappoint. Phantom Menace stormed into the market, raging across the summer of 1999 as the biggest movie of the year, raking in $431 million domestically and $924 million worldwide, becoming the most successful Star Wars movie ever, unadjusted for inflation, and the second most successful movie of all time, trailing ever so slightly behind Titanic. But unlike the other movies, as time went on, reactions took a big shift. While the loud, immediate outcry was positive, over time dissenting voices began to ring louder and louder. People began to voice their larger flaws with the movie. They didn't care as much about the characters, they felt the movie was boring and uninteresting, and famously, they didn't like Jar Jar. When the original movies came out, and especially when the re-releases happened in 1997, screenings were met with cheers, applause, and laughter at every turn. But with Phantom Menace in theaters, screenings were dead silent. No one made a sound, even during the moments that were meant to be funny. Reviews were a bit more mixed initially. Some critics had fun with the movie, but others were a lot more negative about it. There were even some big questions like, is this movie racist? There are a few notable perceived stereotypes here. Jar Jar is obviously a black stereotype, Watto is a Jewish stereotype, and the Nemoidians are Asian stereotypes. Was that intentional? I don't know. Was it unflattering? Probably. Phantom Menace represented a cultural shift, especially among Star Wars fans. Never before had a movie been so hyped up and ultimately so disappointing. This became a cautionary tale. This movie was just proof of the fact that making movies is incredibly hard, and to put that pressure entirely on one person is probably too much. The original movie succeeded not just because George Lucas had a fantastic idea, but because of all of the people who surrounded him, who challenged some of his ideas to make them even better. Because George Lucas, despite all of his talent, isn't perfect. No filmmaker is. They all have different skill sets that are complemented by the people they work with who have different skill sets. But this time, whether intentional or not, George Lucas ultimately surrounded himself with yes men. A bunch of people who wouldn't challenge his ideas because they felt there was no need to. He's George Lucas. He made Star Wars. But Star Wars wasn't a movie that could be made by one person. It took a team of incredibly talented artists to bring it to life. And while there are talented artists, designers, animators, and all of that for The Phantom Menace, this movie feels so much more singular. This is George Lucas's movie from top to bottom, with all of the pros and all of the cons. And as a result, the overall fan sentiment of "the fans know better than the creator" became so much louder. It was pretty fringe before, but now it was seemingly an undisputed fact. not, which ultimately fed into the darker corners of the fandom, as disappointment inevitably turned to anger. Fans began chiding Lucas, even attacking some of the actors involved, namely Ahmed Best and Jake Lloyd. Both of them were hit incredibly hard by hatred and vitriol from Star Wars fans, and both had to reconcile with the reactions in extremely dark ways. Jake Lloyd renounced his fandom, and Ahmed Best almost took his own life. Thankfully, both of them have recovered. They've both managed to bounce back, and I genuinely wish nothing but the best for them. But it's no secret that they were hit with the absolute worst reaction from Star Wars fans. It was no doubt demoralizing for the cast and crew behind the scenes to see the movie taken this way, to see fans slowly rejecting it over time. Inevitably, the question was raised among the audience, could the next two movies salvage this? Was the whole trilogy a wash? But let's try and not be pessimistic. Maybe Phantom Menace was a fluke accident. It was George Lucas regaining his footing and tripping a bit along the way. You know, it was the first time he had directed a movie since the 1977 original. There are growing pains. Maybe now, with this movie out in theaters, the next two can pick up the pieces and really bring this thing together. After all, kids were still enjoying the movie, and at the end of the day, maybe that's all that matters. For now, fans grappled with their complicated thoughts coming out of The Phantom Menace as they looked to the future hopeful that Episode 2 would stick the landing. In the months following The Phantom Menace's release, a very curious thing happened. Despite the immense scale of the movie's promotional takeover and the huge amount of toys that were sold in 1999, the sales actually wound up dropping off pretty significantly after only a few months. Now, you could attribute this at least in part to the movie's mixed to negative reception, but the bigger contributor is that everything surrounding Phantom Menace was totally over-licensed. They made so many toys, so many pieces of merch, that there was no way they'd all be able to sell. There was a ton of demand, but way more supply. And so, while Hasbro alone made around $500 million from toy sales, their toys eventually hit the bargain bin in a desperate plea to get them out of stores. Now, as for the promotional tie-ins going into episodes 2 and 3, things would be scaled down so the market wasn't overloaded. It would be saturated for sure, but it wouldn't be oversaturated. Home video sales for Phantom Menace were fantastic, however. In April of 2000, the movie made its way to VHS, selling a whopping 100 million copies in its first 2 days. And the movie was nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Best Sound Effects Editing, Best Sound, which are different somehow, and Best Visual Effects. It did wind up losing all 3 awards to The Matrix, but it was still a worthy achievement. On a technical level, Phantom Menace had plenty going for it, and this was recognition on the biggest stage. But now, with the Phantom Menace cycle dying down and people moving on either in hope or disappointment, the time had come for the people at Lucasfilm to begin Episode 2. The middle chapter to the new trilogy was now underway. The Empire Strikes Back for the new generation. Designs pretty much immediately began to be introduced, with Doug Chiang still the design director on the project, leading the team to create a bunch of new things for this new movie. Particularly, this movie would start to bridge the gap between the rounded and serene Phantom Menace designs and the more industrial designs from the original trilogy. There was a clear idea that technology would slowly morph to become what it was in the originals. And this was the first step in seeing the transition, with certain ideas and shapes coming directly from the original trilogy, all the while still being a natural continuation of where Episode 1 left off. At the same time, Episode 2 made a very big technological leap during its pre-production. As the ideas started to come together for the next story, most of the inbound sequences would be designed not with storyboards, but with 3D computer animatics. For the first time, most of a feature film would be pre-visualized in the computer. Previs existed in various forms for the other movies, whether it be using World War II footage for the end of the original movie, filming small models for the speeder chase in Return of the Jedi, or even the computer previs used for the pod race in Episode 1. But this was going to be a big leap, with most of Episode 2 designed and sculpted in the computer, to create a sense of momentum within the shots, create complex camera movements, and even get a sense of the pace of the edit. Also that once they were on set, the sequence had mostly been created, and they could put it together much faster on the day. The big previs section of the movie, which completely bypassed storyboards, was the grand finale. Episode 2 was going to feature a greatly exciting sequence for the larger universe. As originally mentioned in the very first movie, this one would finally give a concrete look at the Clone Wars. Armies versus armies in a grand scale finale bigger than any of the other movies. And the previs process was huge, creating all sorts of never-before-seen images that would then be fully animated by ILM to form even more breathtaking shots that would hopefully blow audiences away. On the downside, however, a lot of the team was a tiny bit rudderless during pre-production. So many elements of the movie were being developed with blinders on. Things were being designed and sculpted based on almost nothing. And that's because developments on the script were slow going. Following the backlash to The Phantom Menace, George Lucas didn't know if he wanted to return to the writer's desk for the second movie. The wind had been taken out of his sails. But over time, he slowly realized that he did want to continue the journey, that he did want to be at the desk penning the next script. And by March of 2000, the first rough draft was created, which would eventually evolve into a proper first and second draft. But Lucas would not be alone at the writer's desk this time, because he also brought in Jonathan Hales to help write the third draft. He, of course, had worked with Lucas before on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Together, the two of them would work day and night to refine the script to the best shape it could be. And eventually, the production teams had something tangible and real to work off of, even though it arrived very late in the day. In fact, the shooting script was completed just 3 days before cameras were set to roll. But before filming could commence, there was one big part of the process that needed addressing, and that's casting. Plenty of actors from Episode 1 would come back. Ewan McGregor, Natalie Portman, Ian McDiarmid, Samuel L. Jackson, and of course the legacy actors Anthony Daniels, Kenny Baker, and Frank Oz. But Episode 2 would also feature a handful of new faces as new characters. Tamura Morrison joined as the bounty hunter Jango Fett, the father of Boba Fett from the originals. Legendary actor Sir Christopher Lee joined as the new villain Count Dooku. He, of course, was returning to big spectacle blockbusters at this time, also starring as Saruman in the currently filming Lord of the Rings trilogy. And his good friend Peter Cushing was in the very first Star Wars movie, so he stepped into this role to, in a way, join his friend in the Star Wars universe, and also have a ton of fun in this big fantasy epic production. Then, of course, you had the most significant role in this movie, a role that wasn't exactly new, but did need a new face: Anakin Skywalker. Episode 2 was going to take place quite some time after the first, so Anakin was going to grow up from being a kid to being a young adult, and a whole legion of actors were tested for the role, to take Anakin into the next step on the tragic path to becoming Darth Vader. You had Charlie Hunnam, Topher Grace, Joshua Jackson, Eric Christian Olsen, Paul Walker, even Leonardo DiCaprio was considered, but he declined since he didn't want to take that big of a leap just yet. And so the role ultimately went to Canada's own Hayden Christensen, because the entire team behind the casting believed that he could portray both the anger and the innocence of the character very well, perfect for this transitory portion of his story. And so, with the cast new and returning assembled, it was time to begin principal photography on June 26, 2000, where for the first time in this series, production would not primarily take place in England. Instead, production took place in Fox Studios in Sydney, Australia. And this time, taking a bit of a pot shot towards the reaction to the last movie, the working title for Episode 2 on set was Jar Jar's Big Adventure. Now that's fun. And this came with yet another huge technological advancement, because this became one of the very first feature films to shoot exclusively with digital cameras. George Lucas, of course, wanted to shoot digitally on Phantom Menace, but the cameras weren't going to be ready in time. But this time, things were finally in place. Sony was already developing a digital camera and worked with Lucas to create a version that could shoot HD at 24 frames per second, matching the frame rate of film. There were some challenges, however. Digital cameras needed a bunch of cables, the camera itself is very big, and new lenses needed to be designed to feed light to the much smaller sensor. Panavision ultimately created the first set of compatible lenses, which in some ways had to be even better than film lenses since they were focusing light down to a smaller point within the camera. This was also a very controversial move, with plenty of outspoken people within the industry, especially those at the American Cinematographer magazine, criticizing the choice. They of course loved film film and all of its advantages and didn't think digital would be up to snuff. But George Lucas was out to prove them wrong, and prove that digital cinema was the way of the future. This was Episode 2's big advancement in George Lucas's quest to make filmmaking easier. When shooting on film, you'd have to wait an entire day, if not more, for the film to come back fully processed. You had to wait at least 24 hours before you could start playing with it in the edit. But with digital, it could be downloaded and logged right away, and an editor could start working on it within just 1 hour. So if something was wrong with the footage, you could see it pretty much right away, and be able to fix it right there on the day. This movie also filmed significantly more against blue screens. Actors would admit that most, if not every single set, had some kind of blue screen effect. They were almost constantly looking at things that weren't there, that didn't exist, which can be a very big challenge for anyone. It made it so that George Lucas was no longer capturing an entire image in one go, he was really capturing an element of a final shot. More elements would ultimately be added later that could all be moved around in the computer to create the perfect shot that he wanted. Now, there was some location filming conducted for Episode 2, but significantly less. The crew spent 1 week in London at the Plaza de España, they spent about 1 week in Italy filming some grand romantic scenes, and they spent a little over a week once again in Tunisia, returning to Tatooine. In fact, they were going right back to the old homestead from Episode 4, which was very nostalgic and very surreal for anyone that was also involved in the original production like George Lucas and Anthony Daniels. But they didn't just film for Episode 2 here, because they took the opportunity to film just one shot for Episode 3. Why come back and rebuild everything in 3 years when you already know what you need and how to accomplish it? But what was the shot? That was being kept under lock and key. People didn't know what the Episode 2 story was going to be, let alone Episode 3, come on. Ultimately, principal photography came to a close on September 20th, 2000, bringing to an end the entire 3-month period of shooting. Now it was time for post-production to enter its full stride going into the year 2001. Like The Phantom Menace before it, Episode 2 was going to go through a nearly 2-year-long post-production cycle, animating all of the immense visual effects that had never before been attempted. The people working on Episode 2 noted that the effects on Episode 1 were child's play by comparison. Editing was once again conducted by Ben Burtt, who ran solo this time, once again doing plenty of editing within the frame thanks to the separation of each element during filming. He was also once again the sound designer on the movie, working with supervising sound editor Matthew Wood and a whole team of sound artists and engineers to create even more incredible sounds for this new movie. From recording airplanes and vehicles to tiny little knickknacks you'd find lying around. There was plenty worked in to continue Star Wars' penchant for having absolutely unbelievable sound at every corner. Eventually, like The Phantom Menace before it, Episode 2 also went into a brief period of reshoots, once again built into the sizable $115 million budget, and based off of the initial rough cut Lucas had seen. One of the key things was that Lucas noted the pace of the movie was lagging before the final act, so a whole new action sequence was added in record time. A sequence set inside of a droid factory, with characters running across conveyor belts trying to avoid being crushed by working machinery. The sequence was conceived very quickly and it was shot even faster, with the actors in front of blue screens filming every live action element in under 5 hours. After that, previs animators would try to use the footage and piece it together to create a sequence after the fact, which would then feed into ILM's visual effects pipeline, creating the sequence as it would ultimately appear. The visual effects pipeline for this movie was also significantly bigger than it was for Episode 1, continuing the huge advancements that Phantom Menace had made to push the movie into the digital stratosphere. Every background would be replaced, there were tons more creatures, vehicles, practically everything was 10 times bigger than it was before. However, technology still wasn't at a place where CG environments could overtake real miniature model work. Making a model was still faster and more cost-effective than creating a digital environment. While there would be some digital environments, so much of the rest of the movie was still completed with incredible miniatures that'd serve as backgrounds for the movie's extensive blue screen use. But there was one big leap for Episode 2's visual effects that would take it leagues beyond, and that was the amount of entirely digital characters that had appeared throughout the movie. In Episode 1, you really only had Jar Jar in a starring role, with occasional other characters coming in as well for a couple dozen shots. But now, digital characters are going to be everywhere. Kaminoans, Geonosians, Dexter Jetster, and the biggest of all, Yoda. In all of the other movies, Yoda was a puppet, manned by the one and only Frank Oz. But this time, he was going to be created entirely in CG. They even did a brief CG test in Phantom Menace to see if this was even a proper road to go down in the future. Of course, they decided that yes, Yoda would be entirely CGI in Episode 2. But despite that, the animators and artists went to great pains to make him look as much like the puppet as possible. They wanted to follow Frank Oz's influence and the way he controlled Yoda as much as possible, so that the transition between CG Yoda here was seamless with puppet Yoda in the originals. All the while using the freedom CG gave them to have Yoda do things he'd never been able to do before, which was hopefully going to be a great joy to fans around the world. In some ways, post-production on Episode 2 was even more laborious than it was on Episode 1, with further technical achievements and advancements made at every step along the way. But with the May 2002 release date beginning to draw closer, it was time for Lucasfilm to begin to drip-feed audiences just a little bit about the next installment, which all began on August 7th, 2001, when after years of speculation, the title for Episode 2 was finally announced as Attack of the Clones. Response to this was still mixed. Just like the reactions to the Phantom Menace title, plenty were apprehensive to the reveal, perhaps even more so considering the still fresh reaction to the last movie as a whole. Famously, even Ewan McGregor was a little puzzled by the title when he learned it on camera.
I just heard the new Star Wars film's called Attack of the Clones. No, it is. Is that better than Phantom Menace? I don't know.
But on the flip side, others pointed out its campy 50s B-movie influences. Attack of the Clones honestly sounds cut from the same cloth as The Empire Strikes Back. It sounds more Star Wars than Phantom Menace did, and it also told audiences definitively that they would see the Clone Wars on the big screen for the very first time. On the small screen, the first movie of this new trilogy made a comeback, with The Phantom Menace released on DVD on October 16th, 2001, joined by a second disc with incredibly candid behind-the-scenes featurettes, as well as a slightly extended runtime for the movie itself, featuring little added bits for the pod race in the middle of the movie. And the DVD sales were nothing to complain about. Despite it being a relatively new medium that people were still slowly transitioning to, Phantom Menace sold 2.2 million copies in its first week, which was enormous, and allowed people to get caught up on this new trilogy just in time for promotional efforts to really kick off for Attack of the Clones. Because finally, in November of 2001, Attack of the Clones really began its marketing presence, starting with this teaser poster, revealing the conceit of Anakin and Padme's relationship, which then expanded to the release of not one, not two, but 3 teaser trailers across the month. The first one premiered in theaters in front of Monsters, Inc. on November 2nd, and it was by every definition of the word, a teaser. With almost no music, this teaser is simply set to the haunting breaths of Darth Vader, with various cryptic shots of characters, location, and effects scattered around. There wasn't much to glean from this, but thankfully it wouldn't be alone. On November 5th, releasing online, the second teaser revealed more about the character dynamics, more visuals, and even some of the humor Episode 2 promised to have.
We decided to come and rescue you. Good job.
But these were only preludes to the main event, because on November 16th, playing in theaters before Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, a third and final teaser clocking in at 2 minutes finally released. And this one went all in on the romantic subplot between Anakin and Padme, promising that it would be completely central to the upcoming movie's story. But eventually, the teaser expanded a bit further with a montage of action and spectacle that showed that there was even more hiding behind it than just the romance. Some were inevitably still riding off the stink of Episode 1, but others were incredibly excited and hopeful for Episode 2. Big story events were on their way, big ideas were going to hit theaters, and if for nothing else, it was still going to provide incredible visuals that no other movie was even attempting to offer. No matter what people's expectations were, there were a lot of eyes on May 16th, 2002. Star Wars Episode 2 was on its way, and people were gearing up for its inevitable debut. Across the first months of 2002, the last stretch of post-production for Attack of the Clones took off. Visual effects were coming down to the wire, with individual shots tweaked until the very last possible moment. George Lucas's ability to iterate on shots and make adjustments was both a blessing and a curse, because it meant you could change things infinitely. Of course, you can't. The movie's gotta come out at some point, leading to the phrase,
"You know, films are not released, they escape."
A mantra certainly not coined by the team behind this movie, but absolutely one used by people behind the scenes to describe the last push towards the movie's release. Especially during one pivotal shot of Yoda, which was changed and adjusted several times up to the last possible minute. At the same time, the final mix was conducted in the last months, combining everything the sound team had done into one final mix to create the latest Star Wars soundscape that'd hopefully wow audiences all over the world. The work was going at full speed ahead towards the May debut, with every team member behind the scenes working tirelessly to make Episode 2 the absolute best movie it could be. And in the final push, promotional efforts took off for Attack of the Clones. On March 10th, 2002, the full theatrical trailer for Episode 2 was aired on the Fox network between Malcolm in the Middle and The X-Files, and was later premiered in movie theaters on March 15th before the movie Ice Age, giving fans the latest great look at the middle chapter in this prequel trilogy.
I will not let this republic be split in two. My negotiations will not fail.
If they do, there aren't enough Jedi to protect the Republic. We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers.
This trailer presents an abridged version of the upcoming film's storyline, teasing the anger within Anakin, an investigative story with Obi-Wan, and especially the creation of a grand army for the Republic, providing audiences with their first good look at the titular clone army and the inbound start of the Clone Wars. It was big, exciting, and leaned a lot more into the humor and adventure, which some believed was missing from Episode 1. And with this trailer's release, excitement for Attack of the Clones hit a fever pitch as everything geared up for the movie's ultimate release.
Begun this Clone War has.
In the last push, following in the footsteps of Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones took over promotion. While it wasn't as overwhelming as it was last time, it was certainly hard to miss. On one hand, you had the theatrical poster, featuring incredible artwork by Drew Struzan, absolutely fitting in with the larger saga's poster game so far. TV spots hit the airwaves, getting TV audiences aware of the inbound release, and there was even a brief teaser showing in theaters just a few weeks before Episode 2's release. This time showing the incredibly exciting reveal, Yoda with a lightsaber. Toys once again took over, with new figures hitting store shelves of the new characters set to appear all over Attack of the Clones. Video games were also created in conjunction with the movie's release. One would release before the movie, a straight Episode 2 adaptation for the Game Boy Advanced. But later in the year, it'd be joined with Jedi Starfighter, the new Droid Army, the Clone Wars, and Star Wars Bounty Hunter, which would allow fans to engage with the universe in all new ways once they hit shelves in November and December of 2002. Before that, in direct tandem with Episode 2's hype cycle, the second ever Star Wars celebration was held in Indianapolis, Indiana. From May 3rd to May 5th, over 27,000 Star Wars fans took to the convention to share in their collective love of Star Wars and their collective excitement for Episode 2. And finally, the movie made its first premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival, The first ever Tribeca Film Festival, actually. It premiered not long after out of competition at the Cannes Film Festival, with plenty of other premieres held across the US and Canada, each raising money for local and large-scale charities, giving back to the communities. Once again, the press cycle for Episode 2 was insane. Despite the backlash to Episode 1, there was no denying the excitement around further Star Wars movies. People once again turned up in droves, dressed up in iconic original trilogy or even prequel trilogy costumes, and got ready to re-enter the universe once again, all under the hope that this one would be better than the last. Or, for those that already enjoyed Episode 1, they were excited to see the narrative continue into Episode 2. The time had finally come. After 3 years since the most pivotal shift in the Star Wars franchise, the middle chapter of the prequel trilogy had arrived. The clock had now turned to May 16th, 2002. So grab your tickets, grab some popcorn, and have a seat, because it's now time for the beginning of the Clone Wars. All of the other Star Wars movies have opened the same way. Once the crawl ends, they tilt down through the stars towards the subject of the first shot. In this movie, however, once the crawl is over, the camera tilts up. So, that's cool. The story this time, as introduced by the opening crawl, is that a group of separatists led by Count Dooku have been breaking free from the Republic. They've been trying to raise an army to overwhelm the limited Jedi forces and ultimately overthrow the Republic to take it down. So, movements are being made within the Republic to create a grand army to fight back, leading to a potential war. Meanwhile, someone is trying to assassinate Senator Padme Amidala. Obi-Wan is sent on an investigation to find out who, and Anakin is sent to Naboo with Padme to protect her. And from here, the story takes off, with each side developing in their own direction. The question is this movie better than The Phantom Menace? Depends on who you ask, mileage will vary, but if you're asking me, I think it's about the same. Once again, the movie presents a legion of good ideas, with tons of stuff to parse through and make sense of in conversations after the fact, but it's still not as entertaining to actually sit down and watch. For whatever reason, Anakin and Obi-Wan are separated again during this movie. This is really the big opportunity for them to grow their bond before the ultimate falling out, especially since they hardly interacted in the last one. But now they hardly interact in this one, and whenever they do, they're constantly snapping at each other. These two guys hate each other pretty much the whole time, which seems to contradict how this dynamic was established back in the originals.
And he was a good friend.
The only time they don't hate each other is this brief scene in an elevator where they talk about adventures that happened off-screen. Fun, bonding adventures that could have been cool to see to dramatize their dynamic, but instead they just talk about it and that's about it. It's a shame because both actors are good and are doing the best they can with what they're given, but they're rarely given a chance to be good together. And I think that's partly what's missing here. This movie is trying to be funnier though. There were some moments of humor in the last one, they almost always fell flat, but this one is a little more successful in its efforts. I mean, we have some little references and nods to the original movies, there's a brief Ahmed Best and Anthony Daniels cameo in a nightclub early on, and there's this bit.
You want to buy some death sticks?
You don't want to sell me death sticks.
I don't want to sell you death sticks.
You want to go home and rethink your life.
I want to go home and rethink my life.
Some of the action here is fun. There's a brief sequence set in the rain that has some good moments littered throughout.
Oh, not good.
And on a technical level, there are plenty of good things in this movie. The sound is once again fantastic, with ships, lightsabers, blasters, everything going off at full force during the entire runtime. There are even some new sounds like the endlessly iconic seismic charge, which is great not just because of the sound it makes when it blows, but the absence of sound just before it blows. I could hear that thing go off all day. Shame it only happens twice in this movie. That stuff's awesome. And like always, the music is fantastic. John Williams once again comes in with a fantastic soundtrack, but it's worth noting that there aren't as many new themes this time. John Williams was pretty busy in 2002, with his efforts stretched between this, the second Harry Potter movie, Minority Report, and Catch Me If You Can. So it's not surprising that a lot of this music is reused from Phantom Menace. But the new music that is here is great. I personally really like the Camino theme. It has a perfect amount of mystery and edge to it. It's very good. And once again, the visual effects are very impressive. Things are once again revolutionary for the film industry, with tons of advancements specifically for digital characters, like Dexter Jetster, owner of a 50s bar on Coruscant. Jar Jar is back, although because of the backlash to the last movie, his role here is significantly smaller. That doesn't stop him from looking into the camera at one point though as a direct message to everyone who hated him last time. He's just like, oh, you hate me? Well, I'm still here, suck it, losers. And I think that's rad as hell. And then of course, the most talked about CG character here is obviously Yoda. For the first time, Yoda was an entirely CG effect interlaced with live action actors. And it's definitely an achievement technologically. It's proof that something like that could work. His face can emote, he can do things the puppet probably couldn't, but that puppet still looks amazing, and this doesn't quite look as good as that. This is fantastic as a novelty, as a proof of concept for digital characters, but some of the charm of the original puppet is definitely lost. There's another thing that's lost a little bit with this movie overall. It's lost all the dirt and scratches you'd so commonly find on film. Because this movie was the first big blockbuster to shoot entirely on digital, it's a bit too clean. Now, it's down to personal preference, but I think film grain and film shake, all that kind of stuff, adds to the charm of movies. These imperfections make things visually that much more interesting. But this movie looks flawless, which in itself is a flaw. There's a digital sheen over everything, everything feels flatter and less interesting to look at. There are also limitations to the excessive use of blue screens. You can often see the separation between the actors and the backgrounds in plenty of cases. The actors are also more often than not reacting to nothing, which they can sometimes pull off, like when Obi-Wan meets up with Dexter Jetster and he's genuinely happy about that. But other times it feels like their reactions should be 10 times amplified.
Very impressive.
You sound a little bored saying that, good sir. I mean, are you seeing this? No, he's seeing this. I mean, he might have been given some concept art and different pieces that told him what he was looking at, but it's still a challenge to emote and feel awe against something that's not there. And then, of course, you have an aspect to this movie that bothers me specifically to no end: digital zooms. They appeared very sparingly in the first movie, but now they're all over this one. Digital zooms are when the people behind the scenes take an otherwise static shot, realize it needs a bit more energy, and decide to push in with keyframes in the edit. This is obviously something people will do with home movies or smaller productions all the time, and in those contexts it's perfectly fine. But on a $115 million movie like this, it looks bad. I don't like it. This kind of zoom does not behave the way actual zoom or actual camera movement does. The foreground elements are not separated from the background, so there's no parallax, something that would happen if the camera was moving, and the depth of field isn't changing, which would happen if a lens was actually zooming. Zooming in with a lens is just the act of moving the glass within it, which reshapes the light heading into the film, or in this case, the sensor. Light changes when you zoom, but since this zoom is created entirely in post, it just looks like a still image that's being made bigger on the screen. It's distracting every time. The reliance on blue screen this time and the attempts to make filmmaking easier really catch up with the filmmakers here. When locked on a set, and not even a set, a big blue room, the camera can only move so much. And it's also possible, though speculative, that they were incentivized not to move the camera too much or else they wouldn't be able to track the backgrounds later. Now, the reason I say that's speculative is because this is just how George Lucas shoots things, and has been shooting things things his entire career. But the filmmaking practice of creating every single shot out of layers means the whole thing is essentially created in post, and they don't realize they need a camera movement until months after they're done shooting, which is why the digital zooms happen. But it also means that once the fully CG sequences take over, the camera's suddenly moving a whole hell of a lot more. Once the camera is no longer tied to physical limitations, it goes anywhere and everywhere, which creates a weird split in visual styles for this movie. It feels like the CG sequences are directed by someone else, because they are. George Lucas often let the previous animators just do their thing with the entirely CG sequences, with the only mandate being make it look cool. Even John Knoll kind of became a bit of a director for the visual effects only sequences, and all of these people shoot things very differently than George Lucas does. Whenever Lucas takes over on set, the camera's locked down on a tripod or something, but once the CG takes over, like in the opening speeder chase, we're soaring around doing wild things at every turn.
Pull up, Anakin. Pull up!
It's a very weird separation that is really caused by the ease of not having to physically move a camera in a CG environment, so it can do crazier and crazier things. Then, of course, we get into the real meat and potatoes of this movie, the story. And it feels very much like a first draft. First drafts are incredibly important to the writing process. They're the first time a whole movie story is seen on the page in its complete form. But then comes the second, third, fourth, however many drafts after that to smooth over, condense, simplify, and expand on certain things that need it. But it doesn't really feel like that happened here. For one thing, there are a lot of ridiculous things in this story. Like Newt Gunray hiring Dooku, who hires Jango Fett, who hires Zam Wesell, who hires a robot, who hires worms to try and kill Padme. Worst assassination attempt in history right there. Then there's the fact that Padme isn't the queen anymore, which is strange because I thought they were making her the queen in the last movie because she's said to be Princess Leia's mother, and the mother of the princess is the queen. But here she's just a senator, so I guess they dropped that part. Also, I guess Naboo elects its queens, and they only serve for 2 terms? They also elect when the queen's only like 14? What's happening over on Naboo? Are they child traffickers too? It's worth noting, though, that of George Lucas's many talents, he has a fantastic story sense. He knows how point A can lead to point B can lead to point C. He knows that this trilogy is ultimately about Palpatine's slow acquisition of power, and that starts with him manipulating events to become Chancellor in Episode 1. He also knows that if you separate a kid from his mother at age 9, that's gonna lead to some internal issues later on. And it's even played up here when Anakin finally reunites with his mother after 10 years away, only for her to die in his arms. It's one of the few genuinely affecting moments in this movie. It's played really well. All of the issues, however, come in the execution. Anakin reuniting with his mother only for her to die is a solid idea, and the moment it happens is good, but the route to get there is convoluted and very weird. This movie introduces young Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru, and for whatever reason, it decides to take a complicated route to explain how exactly they're related to Anakin so they can be Luke's actual aunt and uncle in Episode 4. Apparently, Owen's father Klieg Lars bought Shmi Skywalker off of Watto and then married her, making Owen Lars the stepson of Shmi and stepbrother of Anakin. But that's really weird, man. I mean, you fall in love with a person and decide to purchase her? That's weird. It also doesn't help that we never get to see true love happen, or understand that maybe there are other things at play here. We're only told about it after the fact. Which brings me to a fairly damning question. Did the filmmakers forget about Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru? Obviously they remembered them in time for Episode 2, but did they forget when making Episode 1? It feels like they might have. There doesn't need to be a biological or even marriage level connection for them to be Luke's aunt and uncle in the original. They can just be family friends. But if they were just going to be family friends, they would have probably needed to be introduced in the first movie when we're also introduced to Shmi and Anakin. And since that was never in the first movie, it tells me they might have forgotten to put it in there and had to figure out a convoluted way to work them into the story so things lined up. Either that or this was the plan the entire time, in which case, That's a very weird plan. It is very funny though that these guys own C-3PO, who has skin now by the way, because it means that when Uncle Owen bought 3PO in the original, he was buying a droid he already owned 20 years earlier. Maybe he got senile and forgot, but it's really funny.
It seems that he is carrying a message from an Obi-Wan Kenobi.
And then comes the love story. Because Attack of the Clones, more than anything else, is a romance movie. And again, from a zoomed-out story perspective, everything makes sense. The Jedi forbid attachments, they have a celibacy law and stuff like that. Can't lose what you don't care about. But Anakin falls in love with Padme regardless, which will of course cause a divide between him and the Council in time for Episode 3. This is fine. Forbidden love that adds to Anakin's eventual turn? That makes sense. But unfortunately, given what's in the movie, I have no reason to believe that these two characters would ever actually fall in love. Anakin falling for Padme? That makes total sense. He's a straight guy and she's Natalie Portman. That's a two-piece jigsaw puzzle if ever there was one. But Padme falling for Anakin? I don't see it. Because outside of a nice dinner and some frolicking in the grass, Anakin does everything wrong. In fact, let's go through a checklist real quick. Things to not do on a date with Anakin Skywalker. Don't argue with your boss in front of her.
We'll not go through this exercise again, Anakin. And you will pay attention to my lead.
Why? What?
Don't complain about your boss like a child the moment he leaves the room.
He's overly critical. He never listens. He doesn't understand. It's not fair.
Don't look at her like that.
It makes me feel uncomfortable.
Sorry, milady.
Don't tell her you dream about her. Often.
You're exactly the way I remember you in my dreams.
Don't interrupt your date during her important business meeting.
Oh, Anakin's not a Jedi yet. He's still a Padawan learner. But I was thinking...
Hold on a minute.
Excuse me.
Don't interrupt your date during her important business meeting. Again.
There's some places up there that are very isolated.
Excuse me. I'm in charge of security here, milady.
Don't start promoting the merits of a fascist dictatorship.
Sounds an awful lot like a dictatorship to me.
Well, if it works.
Don't go on a rant about how you went on a rampage and killed men, women, and children.
They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals.
Don't go on a rampage and kill men, women, and children. And for bonus points, don't talk about how much you hate sand.
I don't like sand. It's coarse and rough and irritating, and it gets everywhere.
Pretty much all of these things should set off red flags, but for whatever reason, they don't. Maybe Padme's just a freak like that. This might be a match made in heaven, who knows? At the very least, the musical theme for them is great. This is the premier new musical piece for this movie, and John Williams gave it his all. Not only does it carry a very romantic feeling behind it, but it also sounds very tragic. There's this undercurrent of unease because we know where all of this is inevitably going to go. Then you have Obi-Wan's side of the story, which is actually a detective story. And that's fun, seeing Obi-Wan do some investigation, figuring things out. I like Ewan McGregor, and he's clearly having fun here. It's also worth noting, though, that Obi-Wan is the world's worst detective. I mean, he needs a kid to tell him that maybe the planet he's searching for that isn't in the archive memory might have been removed. You couldn't have put that together yourself? He's also bad at investigating the central conspiracy, but that's because if he was good, he'd unravel the entire thing, and we can't have that happening yet. Obi-Wan follows a trail leading him to the planet of Kamino, where he not only finds the bounty hunter Jango Fett, but he also finds that the Kaminoans have been using Jango as a source for their clone army. He's even got his own clone son, Boba Fett, because he can't just be a regular kid, he's gotta be a clone of his dad. Maybe Jango just couldn't find a girlfriend. Happens to the best of us, pal. But this army was apparently requested by Jedi Master Sifo Dyas for the Republic at least 10 years ago. This is cool, but also strange? This request was not sanctioned by the Jedi Council, and Obi-Wan is led to believe that it might have been requested by the Senate without the Council's approval. Meanwhile, Obi-Wan believes Jango is the bounty hunter trying to assassinate Padme, and even follows him back to Geonosis, which is the site of a huge battle droid factory and the main operating base for the Separatist army. Obi-Wan even learns that Jango wasn't hired by Sifo-Dyas, he was hired by a man called Tyrannus. So, through Jango, both the clone army and the Separatists are connected, which seems oddly suspicious. Why would these two seemingly opposing armies be connected like that? Well, once captured, Obi-Wan learns directly from Count Dooku that the Republic is under the control of a Sith Lord.
Hundreds of senators are now under the influence of a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious.
Oh boy, that would connect all of this. A Sith Lord overseeing the Republic? Maybe he's manufacturing both sides to sow conflict for some nefarious purpose. How's Obi-Wan gonna respond to that?
I don't believe you.
Oh. Alright. I was thinking that was the big kicker that'd twig you on what's happening, but Obi-Wan doesn't believe Dooku, so he just stops investigating. It's really cool because the reason he has to stop investigating is because he was only a few steps away from figuring it all out. If he decided to dig just a bit deeper, he'd realize that whoever was pulling the strings in the Republic was doing so in order to cause a war that'd give him more power. And who would be in a position to receive more power if a war broke out? Chancellor Palpatine. Too bad this is only episode 2. We can't be having anyone figuring that out just yet. We gotta save that for next time. Palpatine does get emergency powers though, granted to him by Jar Jar Binks. Only after like first grade level manipulation, of course.
But what senator would have the courage to propose such a radical amendment?
If only Senator Amidala were here.
A few moments later.
Misa propose that the Senate give immediately emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor.
And so, a clone army is officially sanctioned by the Senate, and Yoda heads to Kamino to begin recruiting them into the Republic, which leads everything to the finale. Thankfully, this finale does not add to the others by having 5 simultaneous final battles. I mean, we reached critical mass with 4. 5 would be a nightmare. Instead, we get a string of big sequences laid back to back. We have a big sequence inside of a droid factory, which, outside of the fact that it's clearly rushed, I don't mind it. It's at least a novel idea by this point, so... But things certainly get better once we enter the big Geonosian arena. This bit is pretty cool, with our 3 heroes back against the wall as these huge creatures approach, ready to kill them.
I've got a bad feeling about this.
Well, yeah. I'd be concerned if he didn't. But this sequence is fun. It's more interesting than some other bits because it's one of the few moments in the movie where the characters have to make it out without their lightsabers. But that doesn't last too long as suddenly an army of Jedi appear. And for the first time, this movie delivers on the promise of seeing the Jedi in their prime. A couple hundred Jedi face off against a whole bunch of battle droids. Even the new super battle droids, which are only slightly tougher? Mace Windu is even here, and he's carrying a purple lightsaber. Everyone else either gets blue or green, but here comes this guy rocking the grape-flavored lightsaber. Mainly because Samuel L. Jackson wanted it. Not only so that he could stand out during the action, but also because purple looks cool.
Good guys are green and blue, bad guys are red. That's just the way it works.
No purple left?
You might get purple.
And it does look cool, even when Mace Windu charges up and kills Jango Fett. I guess this really means the investigation is over. Could have asked that guy some follow-up questions about his connection to both sides of this whole thing, but he's dead now. So... But then, the whole thing leads to the beginning of the Clone Wars, because suddenly Yoda shows up with a clone army to turn the tide. The battle from here gets so much bigger. An army of droids versus an army of clones. A battle the scale of which had never been seen before. Once again, the direction is quite different once the CG sequences take over, but there are some benefits, like one bit where the area is covered in dust and you can see the blaster fire glowing in the air, a first for the series. And there are a couple of snap zooms, which look significantly better than the digital zooms because these ones behave like a camera lens actually should. It is weird though that the Jedi immediately become soldiers once this battle kicks off. There's no hesitation, they're now generals on the battlefield.
We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers.
A few moments later.
Around the survivors, a perimeter create.
It's just an immediate turn, which could make sense if that was made into a very central storyline in the movie. Maybe seeing some Jedi voice dissenting views on this whole idea. More people arguing back and forth about what the role of the Jedi is and what it could become if war breaks out, because as it stands, these guys are just huge hypocrites who suck. Maybe that's the point though. Who knows? And then it all leads into a climactic lightsaber duel where Obi-Wan and Anakin face off against Count Dooku. And this fight definitely doesn't live up to the Maul fight from last time. The choreography is nowhere near as intricately detailed or visually exciting. There is one bit where the lights go out and the lightsabers glow against their faces. That's a first. They're not doing anything interesting with that, but it is a thing that happens. And then the fight ends with loss. Obi-Wan gets pricked a couple times by Dooku, and then Anakin, well... Yo, it's a reference to that other movie. But despite that seeming loss, this fight's not over yet, because Yoda pops in and fights Dooku one-on-one. And on a technical level, there is something to be said about this achievement. This wicked fast little frog guy jumping around and slashing at Dooku with a lightsaber. There's only one little thing. To me, Yoda should never use a lightsaber. When the character was introduced in Empire, he was primarily defined by the fact that his size didn't matter. Even though he was a 2-foot-tall frogman, he was stronger than anyone. It was the whole bait and switch of the reveal, turning our preconceived notions about what a powerful character would look like entirely on its head.
Luminous beings, Zoe, not this crude matter.
The magic of Yoda is that he is super powerful without needing his physical size. It's the whole point of his appearance in Empire. But once you give him a lightsaber, suddenly you're putting him in a confrontation where his physical stature is a lot more important. He's now got to jump around in order to even match a regular-sized human. His lightsaber is even shorter than all the others, so he's got to do even more work to live up to everyone else. I don't mind giving Yoda an action scene, but it could have been far more interesting if it was just him and Dooku trying to outwit each other with the Force, not outmaneuver each other with lightsabers. But ultimately, Dooku manages to distract Yoda, allowing him to escape. He flees Geonosis as our characters regroup, giving the movie its climactic moment to see us out. Dooku reunites with his master, the sinister Darth Sidious. Yoda declares that the Clone Wars have begun, and now we see the army of clones mounting up for war, set to the tune of the Imperial March. Now that's a good musical choice, letting us know that the Republic under Palpatine is well on its way to becoming the Empire. And it's accomplished entirely with music, no dialogue whatsoever. Good work on that one. And finally, despite all of the red flags, it turns out Padme is a freak like that and decides to marry Anakin in secret, beginning a new era of hiding their lives from everyone they know. And with an iris close, the movie wraps up. That's Attack of the Clones. Overall, mileage will vary, but I think it's still not that great. It's a technologically impressive movie that also has the strange distinction of looking fantastic at some points and absolutely terrible at others. Reviews were still mixed. Some claimed that this might have been the worst movie of the series, but others said that it was a definite step up from Phantom Menace, maybe even being better than Return of the Jedi. A lot of fans still didn't like it, however. It wasn't nearly as shocking as the disappointment was the first time. Fans were now prepared for the possibility, but some inevitably walked out of the theater not entirely enthused with what they had seen. Some definitely enjoyed it more than Phantom Menace, and it certainly played well with kids, which again might be the only thing that matters. The box office for the movie was also nothing to sneeze at. Across its run, Attack of the Clones made a whopping $302 million domestically, and and $645 million worldwide, which was a step down from Phantom Menace, but that's not unexpected. Empire made less than the first movie when it was released in 1980, so. However, this was the first Star Wars movie that wasn't the biggest movie of the year, falling behind Sam Raimi's Spider-Man domestically, as well as the second Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings movies worldwide. Star Wars was still one of the biggest things around, but for just this one year, it wasn't the top dog, with plenty of other franchises entering the fray to capture audiences just like the original Star Wars trilogy did 20 years earlier. This new movie did do something the others didn't, however. It briefly saw a release in IMAX in November of 2002. While it was never shot for IMAX, the movie was released on the biggest screens around. It even got a special poster commemorating the event. The only issue was, due to technical limitations, IMAX showings could only be 120 minutes max, and Attack of the Clones was 142 minutes total, not only making it the longest Star Wars movie, but too long for a standard IMAX screening. So, when shown in IMAX, 22 minutes of the movie were removed in order to fit it into the screening. So if you saw it on the biggest screens around, it would have been a much shorter movie, missing key moments that were deemed not essential enough for the 120-minute showcase. All in all, Attack of the Clones left fans in a very similar spot that Phantom Menace did, still receiving mixed reception from fans and critics, and still often claimed as being much worse than the original trilogy. If for nothing else though, this did mean that there was one movie left. One more movie to close out the entire saga. Episode 3 was gonna be the big one. The one to close the gap between the prequels and originals. Fans would finally see the rise of Darth Vader and the fall of the Republic. Only 3 more years and Episode 3 would close out the entire saga. Only 3 more years and Star Wars will finally be complete. The process for writing Episode 3 began even before Episode 2 was released. George Lucas knew that this was the final chapter, where everything would close out with one big bang. All of his remaining ideas were now on the table to be concentrated into one final movie. There was no holding back, there was no pushing things until the next movie. This was it. This was the conclusion of the Star Wars saga. The scripting process still took a while, with the crews working on bits and pieces of information until at least the first draft was completed in April of 2003. Everyone had to make their way through Lucas's ever-changing ideas while still working with a slowly approaching deadline. The design team worked around the clock to create the new designs and look for the third movie, with the team being led by the concept design supervisors Eric Tiemens and Ryan Church. Together, along with the team behind them, they'd hone in on a darker look for this final movie, bridging the gap between the prequels and the originals. One of the big things that needed a design in the movie was the new villain. George Lucas had envisioned a new droid leader, General Grievous. Tons of ideas were presented, from the most absurd to the most gothic. Some of these ideas were interesting, and some would work their way in as something else, but ultimately it was this look that sold Lucas. A primarily droid-like figure with organic eyes. That was exactly what Lucas needed to sell General Grievous as the final villain for this trilogy. The cast also reassembled in the months before shooting, with plenty of the same people from Episode 2 making a comeback. Ewan McGregor was back, now fully invested in making sure his performance properly bridged into Alec Guinness's work in the original. His look, his mannerisms, everything needed to get as close as it could. While it was still going to be Ewan McGregor, this was the last chance to see how his Obi-Wan Kenobi became Ben Kenobi from Episode 4. Beyond that, Natalie Portman, Ian McDiarmid, and Samuel L. Jackson were back. Jimmy Smits, who had a brief appearance in Episode 2, was going to get a beefed-up role as Bail Organa, alongside the legacy actors Anthony Daniels, Kenny Baker, Frank Oz, and even Peter Mayhew, returning to the franchise as Chewbacca for the first time since Return of the Jedi. Which means Episode 3 would not only see the return of Chewbacca, it'd also see a deep dive into Wookiee culture, journeying to their home world of Kashyyyk, the hints of which were very exciting for fans. And then of course, the man of the hour, Hayden Christensen. Anakin's arc was going to come together with a dark turn in this third movie, and this was the time to really play that up. In this case, he was asked to bulk up for the role. Anakin would have matured by the time of Episode 3, so physically he needed to look stronger and fiercer after a couple years of non-stop war. His hair would also be different, with plenty of variations being presented before ultimately landing on the long hair look, giving Anakin a Jedi mullet a little like Obi-Wan's from the last movie. And now, with all of the cast reassembled, they all journey to set for the start of production on June 30th, 2003. This time all under the working title, The Bridge, since this was the bridge between Episode 2 and Episode 4, the final piece to the saga. Once again, Episode 3 filmed in Fox Studios Australia for the entirety of principal photography. That's right, the entire principal shoot was conducted within sound stages. George Lucas's ambition to make filmmaking easier came together in this magnum opus of digital filmmaking technology. Everything is shot against a blue or green screen with partial sets. Digital cameras are used for every single shot. Sometimes they'd even shoot with 2 cameras, covering both sides of a conversation at once. Video Village, where the director can see the shots through a monitor, was huge. Several big screens allowing the entire crew to see what was on screen in great detail, meaning they could go in and adjust things right then and there if they saw fit. And the turnaround on digital is near instantaneous. The footage can be copied, transferred, and documented within the same day it was shot, meaning an editor can work on the footage and put something together that exact day. It's crazy. But with all of the pros, there are controversial elements to this particular filmmaking style. The filmmaking process can become significantly more mechanical. George Lucas is very often locked away from the actors, stuck behind the screens at Video Village. Actors are more often than not acting against nothing. Just like in Episode 2, they have to really imagine what's in front of them, a skill that is not easy to achieve. With every advancement George Lucas was making in the field of digital technology, new challenges were raised that hadn't really been felt on film or on sets. But despite everything moving far more into the digital world, there were some things still made for the actors and camera operators to engage with. There were still sets that had to be constructed, vehicle sets were made that could rotate and jog around, there were smoke effects, there were props like weapons and lightsabers, obviously costumes were everywhere, with tons and tons of outfits created for the movie. There was even a rotating set for a key action sequence inside of a falling starship. And luckily for the actors, George Lucas would come out from behind the monitors to engage with them on set. He was interacting right then and there when the actors needed it, and that we love to see. As the shoot went on, the crew found themselves working on plenty of exciting sequences and ideas. For one thing, Ian McDiarmid got to play the Emperor again. Full costume, full makeup, returning to the ultimate villain he'd played 20 years before in Return of the Jedi. For another thing, this movie was also going to see the rise of Darth Vader, which also meant Darth Vader was going to be on set. Originally, Lucas thought that he'd find another 7-foot-tall man to play the character just like he did the first time around. But Hayden Christensen himself campaigned to be put in the suit for the sequence, and after enough convincing, he was finally put into the full Darth Vader costume, with lifts to help give him the stature of David Prowse back in 1977. This was the full completion of Anakin's arc across this trilogy, and so it was a no-brainer for Christensen himself to be in the suit. He got to become Darth Vader. Then, of course, you had the biggest and most climactic part of the shoot, the final duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin. This was it. This was the big moment where friends would turn enemies, and the trilogy would turn tragic. Training for the fight was conducted weeks, even months before shooting. The choreography was insane, trying to match 2 equally skilled fighters in a long-standing matchup between them. The actors worked their hearts out to battle each other to the end. It's the ultimate sequence of not just this movie, but the entire trilogy. And while this was only a piece of it, given Lucas's desire to film elements instead of complete shots, it was a foundational piece. While they'd be surrounded by fire and ash, the core of it is in the two of their performances, making the shooting of it very exciting for everyone involved, which ultimately led to September 17th, 2003, where after 4 months of grueling work in front of blue screens and green screens, production on episode 3 came to a close. Cameras were put away as the process shifted entirely to post-production. Fans on the outside, however, could really only get bits and pieces during production, little slices of information that managed to squeak out, which were few and far between. So, what if you wanted a little something more Star Wars before episode 3 hits theaters in 2005? What if you wanted to engage with the series before that? Well, in November of 2003, an all-new animated series began airing on Cartoon Network. Developed by Genndy Tartakovsky, this show would be the first big dive into the Clone Wars. Set right after Attack of the Clones, this first season features a batch of 10 3-minute episodes chronicling different adventures across the early days of the titular Clone Wars. Featuring spectacular 2D animation combined with some cel-shaded 3D animation, some great action, and even introductions to all new characters like the 2 new villains, Asajj Ventress and Dirge, both working under the controlling arm of Count Dooku. This series features very minimal dialogue. Instead, it tells its story through the action and visuals. It's built off of its set pieces more than anything else, which is where it really hits its stride. We get to see the Jedi be cool with their lightsabers. Kit Fisto gets to have a big sequence underwater, Obi-Wan gets plenty of good moments, even Anakin gets some moments to shine as the best star pilot in the galaxy. There was a lot to enjoy about this batch of episodes. A glimpse into Star Wars on TV for the first time since the Ewoks show back in the 80s. But this first batch of 10 episodes wasn't all, because another set of 10 episodes began airing in the new year 2004. Once March rolled around, 10 more 3-minute episodes aired daily on Cartoon Network, expanding on the show's reach to include more action and spectacle. Yoda gets to fight some droids, not only showing off his skills, but also his wisdom and knowledge of the Force. Anakin gets a big standoff with Asajj Ventress, even leading more into his darker instincts as he ultimately defeats her. And Mace Windu gets to be incredibly awesome, with a huge sequence dedicated to him alone fighting off against an army of super battle droids. He might start with a lightsaber, but after a while he's just punching the droids' guts out and they go down. It's honestly the coolest Mace Windu has ever been. And finally, the last episode of this second batch introduces the fierce and imposing new villain, General Grievous, a droid commander set to have a big role in the next movie, presented here as a completely capable and threatening force against the Jedi. He's collecting their lightsabers, he's using every tip and trick in his arsenal, he can outmatch several Jedi at once. I mean, he's really got it all. This show did a lot to bridge the gap between episodes 2 and 3, with characters going on several adventures that'd lead into the upcoming third movie. And its animation was greatly praised by fans and critics alike. If you were super invested in Star Wars at the time, this was a must-watch. Mace Windu was so cool in that one bit. He just went all kapow and kaboom, and it was crazy. Meanwhile, as 2004 got underway, post-production for episode 3 was now in full swing. The editing side of the movie was already in full swing. It had been for a while. The editors had been working both before and during production, playing with the footage as it came in. But now, with photography wrapped, there were no more limitations. All of the footage was on the table, every possibility was open. This movie was edited by 2 people. Ben Burtt, of course, who'd edited the previous 2, joined by newcomer Roger Barton. Together, they'd work on select sequences to piece together the entire movie, create its sense of pace and momentum, and ultimately form what it's going to look like. And during this process, they cut out a lot of scenes. George Lucas, inspired by the ongoing Lord of the Rings trilogy, decided he wanted episode 3 to be a grand epic. In fact, the initial cut of the movie spanned over 3 hours in length, with the opening action scene taking up 1 whole hour at the start. But as the editing process continued, the whole thing wound up being pared down quite a bit. Lucas's ambition for a big epic wound up being sidestepped to create a movie that was far closer in length to Attack Attack of the Clones. But this meant that a lot had to be removed, even entire characters, because Genevieve O'Reilly was cast as a young Mon Mothma, set to take part in the more politically heavy subplot with Padme, Bail Organa, and others. But that whole side of the story wound up being removed, so she too got taken out of the final cut, ultimately to shrink the movie to a more manageable length. Episode 3 would still be big, but it wouldn't be as big as Return of the King, at least not in terms of length. At the same time, the sound was ongoing, with Ben Burtt pulling double duty as the movie's sound designer, creating tons of sounds while working with supervising sound editor Matthew Wood. Together, they created and recorded a ton of sounds to fill out every iota of the movie on the audio side of things. But they also had one other thing to worry about, and that was the voice of General Grievous, which took a long time to land on. Originally, Gary Oldman was approached to take on the role, but given that he was a union actor and this wasn't a union production, he decided not to take part so as not to step on any toes. So the sound team sent out an audition call, and who else but Matthew Wood decided to send in a tape. Anonymously, of course. He sent it in under the initials AS for Alan Smithy. Surprisingly though, his tape won out against all others, and it wasn't until the rest of the crew asked for a follow-up that they realized it was Matthew Wood the whole time. And since his tape was the best, he wound up getting the role, recording voice lines for Grievous from top to bottom. At the same time, visual effects were in full swing, led by visual effects supervisors John Knoll and Roger Guyette, as well as animation director Rob Coleman. Together they did all sorts of stuff. Since episode 3 was so much more primarily filmed against blue and green screens, ILM had more work to accomplish than on either of the previous two movies. They had backgrounds, environments, creatures once again, digital models, particles, lighting, all sorts of stuff. Even some practical models, with people like Lauren Peterson being brought in to create physical models for plenty of locations. Even with all of the digital technology, analog can win out every once in a while. At the same time, background plates were filmed around the world. For the limestone mountains of Kashyyyk, backgrounds were filmed both in China and Thailand. And in a lucky break for the filmmakers, Mount Etna erupted in Italy, allowing the team to capture tons of footage of lava exploding from the ground. Perfect for the lava moon of Mustafar, where the final battle was set. At the end of the day, episode 3 had a whopping 2,146 effects shots total. A huge workload that made this one of the most technologically ambitious movies ever made. The question really became, when will audiences be able to see all of this hard work for themselves? While the movie was still a ways out, anticipation and speculation began to run rampant across 2004. Fans were particularly interested in guessing the movie's title, with tons of options being thrown around all across the internet. You had a title like The Creeping Fear, which was actually revealed as an April Fool's gag. Then came some more real suggestions like Rise of the Empire and Birth of the Empire. With tons of titles being thrown around day in and day out, George Lucas eventually admitted that someone had guessed the correct title, that it was out there in the wild. The question was, which one? All of this finally led to July 24th, 2004, where at San Diego Comic-Con, Lucasfilm finally revealed the official title for Episode 3 as Revenge of the Sith. A direct nod to Revenge of the Jedi. This was easily the best title for the prequel films, winning out against The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones. It was darker, it mirrored the title of the third movie of the last trilogy, it sounded the most like Star Wars, so fans were far more on board this time around. But even with the title revealed, there was still a long road ahead for this third movie. Because in August of 2004, additional photography began for Episode 3, this time filming at Shepperton Studios and Elstree Studios in London. Once again, these reshoots were built into the budget, and mainly featured odds and ends that needed to be captured. Since so much was being cut out of the edit, little bridge shots were needed to cover the gaps. The whole process was described as being like filling in potholes on the road. All the little gaps that were left that were able to be filled in. But that wasn't all, as as Lucas also made a number of adjustments to Anakin's central arc. Originally, he was going to fall to the dark side for multiple reasons, but during rewrites and reshoots, Lucas centered the fall around one aspect in particular, streamlining the whole thing. At the same time, in greatly exciting news for fans, on September 21st, 2004, the original Star Wars trilogy was released on DVD. For the first time, the entire trilogy was available in an HD format, this time with even more changes. The additional Jabba scene was now enhanced even further, making the digital model look better. Naboo was added to the montage of planets at the end of Return of the Jedi, and in several moves to streamline the continuity of all 6 movies, prequel ideas were added to the original trilogy to make the transition from one trilogy to the next more seamless. Ian McDiarmid was added to The Empire Strikes Back, taking the place of the original Emperor, with even some of his dialogue getting rewritten. Temuera Morrison was now the voice of Boba Fett, since he was a clone of his father Jango. And finally, Hayden Christensen was added to the end of Return of the Jedi as a Force Ghost, replacing Sebastian Shaw. Now, while this does make the entire saga from Episode 1 to Episode 6 more seamless, it does come with one very big unfortunate side effect. George Lucas wanted this version to replace the original. He wanted this to bury the original. I understand not liking certain elements of the original versions. Every creative person has things they change or adjust about something they made. But film preservation is important, especially for a cultural behemoth like Star Wars. The special editions of these movies aren't what changed the world. The versions that were released in the 70s and 80s are what changed the world. And it's unfortunate that there's so much more inaccessible. But it's also why fan projects that have risen since the DVD's release are so damn awesome. They've worked tirelessly to make sure the original versions of these movies can survive, that they can coexist with the special editions. I don't mind that the special editions exist, but I do mind that it's so much harder to get the originals. The special editions should be complementary pieces to the originals, something additional and fun, not something made to overshadow and replace them. Both versions should be able to exist side by side. But now, with the original trilogy on DVD for the first time and the months ticking by towards the end of the year, the time had really come for the first explosion of promotion for Revenge of the Sith. And eventually, after months of waiting and anticipation, the clock turned to November 5th, 2004, where, debuting in front of The Incredibles in theaters, audiences finally got their first glimpse towards the final Star Wars movie.
For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, before the Dark Times, before the Empire.
Beginning with footage from the other movies, this teaser squarely centers on what fans are most excited about for this final entry. This movie will finally see Anakin Skywalker fall to the dark side to become Darth Vader. And across the final minute, the teaser flashes through huge action sequences, sparing character moments that appear for only flashes, and of course, the full reveal of Darth Vader himself.
Lord Vader. Yes, Master.
Rise.
This was it. This was the big shebang. For fans of the prequel trilogy so far, and for fans of Star Wars in general. This teaser was even joined by the first poster, featuring Anakin Skywalker and his cloak, which flew in the breeze to create the mask of Darth Vader, foreshadowing his turn to evil. With all of this out there getting dissected day in and day out, interest and anticipation was now peaked heading into the new year, 2005. After only a couple months since the first teaser debuted, the marketing really began to heat up in March of 2005. Because once March 10th rolled around, the second full theatrical trailer for Revenge of the Sith was released at first during the OC's The Malpisode, and the next day it debuted in movie theaters playing before the movie Robots, which also starred Ewan McGregor. How about that? And this second trailer is very revealing.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Is it possible to learn this power?
not from a Jedi.
If you were really concerned about spoilers going into Episode 3, you would have wanted to avoid this trailer. Now, a lot of people of course already knew where this was heading. Anakin will become Vader, Padme is likely going to die, the Jedi and the Republic will fall, and the Empire will rise. These are all things that have to happen to bridge the gap. But sometimes you want to wait until the movie to figure out more on the details of how. And while this trailer doesn't reveal everything, it sure does reveal a lot, basically presenting an abridged version of what's set to be in theaters. But for those who are purely interested in the spectacle, this trailer provides tons in that regard. This looks like it's easily the most action-packed movie in this trilogy, maybe even the saga, with climactic face-offs and of course the ultimate final duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin. If for nothing else, this movie looked big, and for some, that was everything. From here, anticipation only skyrocketed as the weeks ticked by and the inbound May 19th release drew closer and closer. In the final weeks of March, the third and final season of Star Wars Clone Wars aired on Cartoon Network, this time with a batch of 5 episodes, each at 12 minutes in length. While the show was still very minimalist, focusing on its action and visuals, there was a bit more in relation to story this time around, as things took off in a far more concrete way to lead up to Episode 3. Anakin becomes a Jedi Knight, he grows out his hair and ultimately gets a scar over his eye. We introduce new ships like the new Republic Star Destroyer, new Jedi Starfighters, and some new Separatist ships, each set to make big appearances in Revenge of the Sith. And in the biggest link towards the upcoming movie, the Separatists, led by General Grievous, strike at the heart of the Republic, attacking Coruscant itself. And despite the greatest efforts by the Jedi, General Grievous eventually captures Chancellor Palpatine. Now, there is a slight discrepancy here between show and movie, because this entire season paints General Grievous as the strongest and fiercest fighter around, and yet the movie was going to present him as, well, not quite that. The characterization between the two versions was going to be quite different. So, in an attempt to better bridge the gap, Mace Windu quickly crushes Grievous's chest, causing the cough and pain that had plagued the character in Revenge of the Sith. Ultimately, the Chancellor is captured and Obi-Wan and Anakin rush off with their troops to launch a rescue mission, leading directly into the movie. There's lots of stuff here that expands and explores different corners of the Star Wars universe, all in incredible 2D animation. It was interesting, it was investing, Star Wars fans at the time were eating it up, and it was the perfect lead-in to Revenge of the Sith, which meant the time was drawing nearer for the ultimate conclusion to this whole thing. Behind the scenes, the post-production efforts worked down to the wire to get the movie done. ILM was working on the visual effects until mere weeks before the movie was set to debut, with so many shots and so many things needing to be finalized at the last minute. Meanwhile, John Williams was back to record new music, once again recording with the London Symphony Orchestra, who had performed the soundtracks for all 6 Star Wars movies, all in a huge effort to bring the saga full circle with the darkest themes yet, as well as some of the familiar tracks from the original movies. This is where it all comes together. And finally, the final mix was conducted in the last weeks, where the entire sound team got together to mix and perfect every sound for what would ultimately be shown in movie theaters, all to create the best result for the audience. This is the final piece to this enormous puzzle. This is where the puzzle gets assembled in a lot of ways. It's big. And on the outside, promotional efforts took off in the final weeks. For one thing, it was announced that Revenge of the Sith would be the first Star Wars movie to be rated PG-13. All of the other movies were simply rated PG, but this one, with its darker tone and darker subject matter, was rated a little stronger at PG-13. George Lucas wasn't holding back. This one was gonna hit as hard as it could. At the same time, fans were greeted with this poster, once again illustrated by the great Drew Struzan, completing the entire saga's tapestry of posters with another incredible piece of artwork. TV spots took over the airwaves, letting everyone know the movie was on its way and nearly in theaters, Revenge of the Sith also filled up toy stores in the weeks leading up to release, with new action figures based on a whole legion of new characters and ideas represented in the movie. And the partnership with LEGO also continued, with sets made for virtually anything that could appear in Revenge of the Sith. Sequences, ships, you name it. If it was in the movie, it was fair game for LEGO. A tie-in video game was released on many platforms, including the PlayStation 2 and Xbox, although it's worth noting that this game was released 2 weeks before the movie was, and still revealed most everything about its story. So if you didn't want to know the details, it was best to stay away from the game, at least until after you saw the movie. Star Wars Celebration was once again held in Indianapolis, Indiana, just like it was in 2002, playing host to over 29,000 attendees. And finally, the movie saw several simultaneous premieres across the United States, because on May 12th, the movie held premieres in Seattle, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Boston, Denver, Atlanta, San Francisco, and Miami all at the same time, all of which raised money for local charities. George Lucas, you mensch. Eventually, the movie premiered out of competition at the Cannes Film Festival on May 16th, and at the Empire Cinema in London, a huge 6-movie marathon was conducted, showing every Star Wars movie culminating in the release of Revenge of the Sith. This was huge. Despite the disappointment around the other 2 movies for some, excitement still managed to reach peak levels for Episode 3. This was it. The ultimate promise and conclusion of the prequel trilogy. Fans would finally get to see the rise of Darth Vader, the fall of the Republic, every last piece of the puzzle left open to close the gap before Episode 4. No matter what you thought of the other 2, you were no doubt interested to see how this whole thing was gonna wrap up, how it'd all fit together and complete the Star Wars saga once and for all. After 6 years since this new trilogy began, and nearly 30 years since the saga began in 1977, it was time to fulfill the promises George Lucas had set out decades before. The clock had finally turned to May 19th, 2005. Exactly 6 years to the day after Phantom Menace's release, Star Wars was back in movie theaters for one last hurrah. Grab your popcorn, grab your lightsabers, because it's now time to complete the saga. Already the opening crawl of this movie is better. We open with the word war, and after that we rush into the opening with purpose. There are still weird things like there are heroes on both sides, evil is everywhere, which I've never been able to make sense of, but overall we're doing a lot better. The opening itself is also very exciting. Already ILM is showing off visual effects prowess better than virtually anything else out there. We have ships flying in all directions, explosions, we transition to a lightsaber fight between Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Count Dooku. The sequence ends with this huge crash, which is very fast and very energetic. We're even doing some big story things like Anakin finally getting the once-over on Count Dooku, and with some pushing from Palpatine, he kills him.
Do it.
It does sometimes feel disjointed and rushed, blasting through so much at wicked speed, but it's a much better way to open this movie than what either of the other 2 did, so we're off to a better start for sure. The question is, can it keep it up? The story this time is that the Jedi Council have requested that Anakin spy on Chancellor Palpatine. They're suspicious of him and need someone close to figure out what he might be up to. So they choose Anakin, someone with an established connection already. Unfortunately, this is an uneasy arrangement for both Anakin and the Council, which is never a good sign.
It's very dangerous putting them together.
I mean, you could just pick someone else if you were that worried about it. Might save everyone a lot of heartache later, actually. At the same time, Padme is revealed to be pregnant, adding a complication to her and Anakin's secret relationship. And the Clone War still rages on, but with Dooku dead, General Grievous is now the sole leader of the Separatists, meaning the Clone Wars are nearly at their end. Once Grievous is down, it's all over. So, the Jedi are sent around the galaxy to face off the last fronts of the war. Yoda's even sent to Kashyyyk, where he meets a bunch of Wookiees like Chewbacca. Haha, love that guy. I also love that some of the visual inspiration for this planet was taken from the Star Wars holiday special. They had to acknowledge its existence, and that's very funny to think about. So now the question is this one better than the last two? Well, yes, but only by a little bit. Revenge of the Sith is a far darker movie. It's able to get by on the subject matter and the fact that it's doing a lot more on a story level. Visually, this movie is also the most ambitious of the three prequels. However, weirdly enough, it's also the least ambitious.
Oh, I have a bad feeling about this.
The opening is a prime example of this. When the CG aspects of the opening take over, we get ships flying left and right, the camera soaring around in these crazy intricate shots. Then, once it cuts to the live action material and Lucas takes over, we're back to static shots locked down on a tripod. It takes the visual discrepancy seen in episode 2 and dials it up to 11. There's even stuff in here that's less exciting visually than episode 1. There's one really obvious sequence for this, because both movies feature a moment where characters are cornered in a hallway by droidicas. In episode 1, Qui-Gon is trying to get into the ship's bridge, cutting through the door. The Trade Federation guys inside are freaking out, calling in for help. There's a dramatic push-in, the music's powering the whole thing, Qui-Gon's melting the door, all until the droidicas show up and change the tide in favor of the Federation, forcing the Jedi to flee. Episode 3 features a very similar scene, so how does it shake up? Man, that's not nearly as exciting as the other one, is it? And those damn digital zooms, man. I know most people probably won't even notice them, but they're so distracting. They drive me insane every time. Just move the camera, come on. Now, this movie being out does mean we can look at the entire prequel trilogy in full form. We can zoom out on a macro level and look at the entire thing. With all three movies available, we're now finally able to ask, why was the trilogy structured the way it was? Why are all three movies so separate? It feels like there's an additional movie in between each movie, thanks to the huge time jumps between each one, making all of the main characters essentially different people by the time the next one starts. Also, why were there 3 villains? The first one had Darth Maul, the second one and part of this one had Count Dooku, and now we have General Grievous. But why do all 3? Things might have worked better if it was just one guy. In fact, if you combine some of the key aspects of these 3 characters into one, you find yourself with a far more compelling villain. A villain that is Qui-Gon's mentor and killer. Someone who can survive after Qui-Gon's death to continue to haunt Obi-Wan, and someone who can eventually cause grief for Anakin, resulting in Anakin brutally murdering him. And then I guess he can also be the catalyst for ending the war. Grievous is probably the least significant of the 3 villains story-wise, to be honest. But those are the smaller questions. The real big question is, why have Anakin and Obi-Wan never interacted as friends before this? The people behind this movie did realize that in order for a big falling out to work, the 2 characters have to like each other first. But the other 2 movies didn't set that up at all, so this one has to pick up all of the slack. They barely interact in the first one, and anytime they interact in the second one, they hate each other. So this one has to rush through all of the legwork of making these 2 characters friends before the end, when it could have been far more effective if they were presented as friends in the first one. The second one can still split them up and have Anakin fall in love with Padme, but the first one really could have had these 2 characters become friends over the course of that story. If they're friends for longer, the eventual falling out hits so much harder. In fact, episode 3 has to pick up all of the slack for the entire trilogy. The first 2 movies did a real poor job setting up some of these ideas. The second movie saw Anakin already getting angry and vengeful, but we need to present him as a hero before the turn. So this movie rushes in some moments where he's a good guy right at the start. Anakin and Palpatine barely interacted in the last 2, so all of that legwork has to be done in this one to strengthen their bond. As a result, episode 3 feels both rushed and slow as a glacier at the same time. It has to speed run through everything it needs to set up, and it also wants to spend time with some of that stuff to build it up enough. And so we're left with long stretches where the movie's spinning its wheels and just has characters talk in rooms. So much of this movie, of this entire trilogy, is talking in rooms. Film is a visual medium, and sometimes I wish that these scenes had a lot more going on visually. The only time they do is in episode 2 when Padme is packing while talking. At least she's doing something. Every other scene is so static and still. It's okay for these characters to be doing things, but maybe it's also really hard since so much reliance is being put on blue screens and adjusting every layer in post months after the fact.
Take a seat, young Skywalker.
But as a benefit to this being the third movie in the trilogy and a benefit of all it has to do, this is the only one of the three where something actually happens. Obi-Wan chases General Grievous to Utapau. There's a big action scene, lots of lightsabers, there's a big hamster wheel at one point. Obi-Wan even has a cool dragon lizard thing. And eventually it ends with the ultimate death of General Grievous. Love that.
So uncivilized.
Which means the Clone Wars are bound to come to an end, as everyone else works to clean up the mess left behind. But the real meat of the story is the fact that we finally see Anakin fall to the dark side, becoming Darth Vader. This is because he's receiving visions of Padme dying during childbirth, putting him on edge. And Palpatine uses a little bit of first grade level manipulation to get Anakin to give in to his darkest urges. Why first grade? Well, Palpatine's not exactly being subtle about what he's doing during this big Plagueis monologue, revealing that there might be a way to save someone from death by use of the Force. Ian McDiarmid is playing the hell out of it, and it is absolutely a highlight of the movie, but somehow Anakin doesn't get twigged that Palpatine is evil even after he does 4 evil head turns during his monologue. I think the dude might be missing a step.
Is it possible to learn this power?
Not from a Jedi.
Thankfully, our main characters do eventually find out that Palpatine is the Sith Lord. They finally discover that he is Darth Sidious, the one in control of the entire war from the beginning to grant himself more power. Unfortunately, they don't find out through their own investigative means. They find out because Palpatine gets tired of waiting and just tells Anakin straight up.
You're the Sith Lord.
And it also leads to probably the worst fight in the trilogy. It's well known at this point that this fight was choreographed with the actors very quickly, and it shows. It feels a lot slower. The constant spins and flips look a lot goofier when they're not at 100 miles an hour. And the other 3 guys with Mace Windu go out like total chumps. 2 swings and they're all dead. It's hilarious. Ian McDiarmid's face is fantastic though. Whenever this fight comes up, just watch what he's doing. He's having such a good time. And it does lead to Palpatine getting his face scarred, finally looking like the Emperor from before. And just before this fight kicks off, there is one great moment where Anakin and Padme silently stare out at each other from across the city. There's no dialogue, it's carried entirely by the music. There's this eerie feel to it as Anakin, purely internally, contemplates what he might do for Padme. Once dialogue is stripped away and the movie goes for something more subtle, it hits so much harder. George Lucas has always been great at the larger story ideas. It's what's easiest to latch onto within this trilogy, but the problems always fall on dialogue and execution. Take dialogue out and all you're left with is Lucas's strongest qualities. And ultimately, Anakin arrives and turns against Mace Windu. Palpatine throws Windu out of a window, nice, and Anakin finally pledges himself to Palpatine's teachings.
You shall be known as Darth Vader.
I love the pause just before he says Vader because it makes it sound like he didn't think of a name at all before this moment. He's just like, yeah, you gotta be a Darth. What's the coolest word I can think of right now? Vindicator? Voracious? Vader? Vader. Yeah, let's go with that.
Thank you, my master.
But there is a slight discrepancy in Anakin's motivations here. Originally, his fall was going to be motivated both by Padme's impending doom and his belief that the Jedi Council betrayed him. Originally, that second thing was going to be a lot bigger, but across re-edits and reshoots, Lucas squarely centered it around Padme. She's the motivating factor for him. However, some of the Jedi betrayal stuff does still make it into the final movie, and it's all weird. For whatever reason, Anakin seems to truly believe that the Jedi betrayed him and Palpatine. Now, it's natural to think that at the start. He felt slighted that the Jedi wanted him to spy on Palpatine, but he ultimately learns that they were totally right. Palpatine was worth being suspicious of. The thing is, he doesn't care anymore and just wants to save Padme, which is why he falls. But even after that, you get lines like this.
I should have known the Jedi were plotting to take over. Anakin, Chancellor Palpatine is evil. From my point of view, the Jedi are evil. Well, then you are lost!
Like, do you actually believe that? You know it's a lie, right? It's fine when he sells that lie to others, and the fact that it's used to turn the entire Republic against the Jedi, but he knows it's a lie, right? There's no reason for him to believe that that's true, and yet it sometimes sounds like he does. Is he stupid? Hell, there isn't even a reason to bend to Palpatine for the Padme stuff either, because they immediately have this exchange.
To cheat death is a power only one has achieved. But if we work together, I know we can discover the secret.
Wait, so Palpatine doesn't actually know how to cheat death? That's the whole reason Anakin's here. He should be furious right now. So the motivations for Anakin are a little off balance, a little strange, and the moment he does turn feels kind of sudden since this movie has to do all of the setup and all of the payoff in one go, instead of doling it out over the trilogy. But motivational problems aside, once the turn happens and things begin to go through a continental shift, the movie comes through with some great sequences. Specifically, Order 66.
The time has come. Execute Order 66.
Words that have echoed across the Star Wars fandom. The moment the clones were all ordered at once to destroy the Jedi. This is a very well done sequence. It's very emotional, it's visually powerful, with shots of clone boots stopping in the snow. Apparently a lot of it was helped along by Steven Spielberg, which is great. It's ultimately a strong montage of the Jedi being killed across the galaxy, with each moment ringing more tragic than the last. Hell, even Anakin gets involved, not only marching into the Jedi Temple with a huge army of clones, but also... Whoa, dude, hold on. You didn't need to go that far. Good lord. This sequence is also carried a long way by the music. In fact, the entire movie is carried a long way by the music. John Williams absolutely kills it once again. There's lots of darker motifs in here, creating themes for the villains, the dark side, even the lava moon of Mustafar, which is one of my favorite little pieces. And then the more emotional pieces come in during the Order 66 scene, where the music is not played up to be dark and evil, it's played to be tragic, which is a wonderful choice. John Williams absolutely brings his A-game to this score that brings the entire story full circle in its most emotional way yet. And it especially helps in the next great sequence, the christening of the Empire. Here we have two scenes intercut. On one hand, we have Anakin killing off all of the Separatist leaders, and on the other hand, we have Palpatine addressing the Senate and reorganizing the Republic into the Empire. One thing I like about this trilogy, and it's an idea that I wish was explored even more within the movies themselves, is that over the course of all three movies, and especially during the Clone War, the Republic was slowly becoming the Empire. It wasn't an overnight swap, it was a slower process. There are scenes alluding to this, which I wish were either far more prominent or slightly better written, but I like the idea that by the time Palpatine declares that this whole thing is the Empire now, it's really just a name change. The Empire already exists. This is just a formality.
So this is how liberty dies. With thunderous applause.
Ultimately, everything builds into a two-pronged finale. On one side, Yoda faces off against the Emperor, the two strongest Force users on either side battling it out. Although it'd be a lot more interesting if they weren't using lightsabers. They should both be above that. It'd be so much more interesting if they were fighting with their wits and knowledge of the Force. There's a little bit of that here, but it could be the entire sequence, and also 10 times more intricate and intense. As it stands, I do like that this fight takes place in the Senate chambers. Really brings a sense of finality to this particular trilogy and what it's trying to do. I also think it's really funny that after effectively losing the fight, Yoda says,
Into exile. I must go. Failed, I have.
Bro lost one fight and immediately threw in the towel. Yeah, I didn't win that one. I gotta go live in a swamp now. Sorry about that. But this is of course intercut with the far bigger side of the finale, the final duel between Obi-Wan and Anakin. Two friends turned bitter rivals. It's the big climactic finale for the entire trilogy, and it is properly huge. The effects are astounding, the location is great. George Lucas wanted a location that represented hell, the worst place either character will ever go, and this accomplishes that nicely. The fight is a bit over-choreographed with lots of spins and flips and all that stuff, and even a moment where they're just spinning their lightsabers for a couple seconds without hitting each other. But then you have moments like the Force High Five, which is fun, and the whole thing is pushed by the emotional power of the two friends falling out. At least, for a while. Because at the end of the day, this fight is too long. Now, I understand that both Obi-Wan and Anakin are evenly matched and could probably go at it for a long time, but there is mileage when it comes to making a sequence entertaining, thrilling, tense, all that stuff. Audiences often require constant reinvention and new information to keep something intense and engaging for long periods of time. If this fight had additional story beats laced into it, it would have far more easily justified its extreme length. But without additional story beats to change the dynamic of the fight, it winds up losing that spark after a while. By the time they get onto the big spire thing and it's fallen into the lava, the emotions of the sequence have faded and it feels like I'm just watching an effects showcase. A very impressive effects showcase, but thankfully it does bring it all together by the end, as the two characters finally stand off. Obi-Wan has the high ground and yet Anakin still tries it. And with that, the fight is concluded. Anakin burns in the lava as Ewan McGregor delivers a killer performance. The dialogue could use a touch more subtlety, but the performance carries it a long way, so we'll let it slide. But that's it. That's the fall of Anakin Skywalker, eventually picked up by Palpatine just in time to get him to safety. And now we head into our final sequence, the last scenes to wrap the whole thing up. In a stark move, the birth of Luke and Leia is intercut with the birth of Darth Vader. It's a very simple choice and an incredibly effective choice. Once again, minimal dialogue powers it as both the next generation's heroes and its villain are born simultaneously. A very good editorial choice. And ultimately, it ends with the death of Padme at the same time. I imagine Palpatine was pulling strings and killing her with the Force or something, but it is really funny when the droid just says, she's lost the will to live. She just decides, you know what, I'm dying now, and then she dies. She might just be a girl boss, to be honest. It's also made even funnier when Vader learns about this and yells, like, you didn't need to do that. I understand the emotion of the scene. I know he's mad. He doesn't need to yell no for me to get it. But now a lot of pieces are in place. Darth Vader is now at the Emperor's side, watching as the Death Star is built in front of them, and the two surviving Jedi, Obi-Wan and Yoda, are set to go into hiding, lining up this trilogy with the originals. There are some continuity mishaps, however, like the fact that Padme dies 2 minutes after Luke and Leia are born. In Return of the Jedi, Leia tells Luke that she still has vague memories of her mother, which doesn't make sense considering what we know now. Because, I don't know if you know this, but babies don't usually remember this part.
She died when I was very young.
Yeah, I'll say. At the same time, C-3PO's memory is erased, clearly trying to clear up how much he knows in time for the original movies. But R2-D2's memory doesn't get erased, so he can just spill the beans whenever he wants to. He can just tell Luke at any point in the originals that Vader is Anakin Skywalker. But he's always been a bit of an asshole, so I wouldn't put it past him to keep that to himself as a joke. It does cause a discrepancy with this line, though.
I don't seem to remember ever owning a droid.
Well, you have owned droids before, and you were pals with this exact droid for like 15 years, so maybe Obi-Wan got senile. Also, did George Lucas forget about Force ghosts? They haven't appeared in any of these movies, and in a very quick scene in this one right at the end, Yoda hints that Obi-Wan might be able to commune with his old master Qui-Gon through the Force. This absolutely feels like an afterthought. Maybe it wasn't, maybe this was the plan, but with Force ghosts appearing so frequently in the other 3 movies, it is weird that they're never around this time. But despite those discrepancies, everything eventually wraps up. Leia is adopted by Bail Organa and his wife on Alderaan, and Luke is delivered to Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru in the one scene that was filmed during production on Episode 2. And now Obi-Wan is set to watch over Luke, becoming Ben Kenobi. And finally, as we stare out into the twin sunset, we watch one last iris wipe bring the whole thing to a close. That right there is Revenge of the Sith. Overall, it's probably the best one of the 3. It still has a lot of flaws on the storytelling and digital aspects, but the spectacle, the action, the fact that something genuinely changes within the story, that all carries it a little above the other 2 for me. Reviews were also more positive compared to the first 2, with critics praising the action and emotion. While some were still as disappointed as they were with the first 2, the reaction to this one was far softer. Revenge of the Sith has always been the prequel that fans have accepted the most, from its darker tone to its more serious sequences and for its spectacle and action. This ultimately feels like the story Lucas actually wanted to tell, and that the other 2 were just warm-ups to a certain degree. The movie also did very well at the box office, which was no surprise. It raked in a whopping $380 million domestically and $868 million worldwide, surpassing Attack of the Clones but falling a bit short of Phantom Menace, which is the same pattern that the original trilogy took, so again, not that surprising. And on the domestic side, Revenge of the Sith became the highest grossing film of the year, while it fell to 2nd place worldwide, trailing just behind the 4th Harry Potter movie. But overall, this was a success. It powered toy sales, it made a ton of money, and was easily the most well-received of the trilogy, even if many were still disappointed coming out of it. The Star Wars prequels are an interesting batch of movies. They are on one hand endlessly commendable for their technological aspirations and even achievements, but also endlessly derided at their time for the storytelling choices, the dialogue, and even some of the nascent technology that hasn't aged nearly as well as the technology for the originals. A lot of fans rejected the technological aspects these movies made, criticizing them for being too stilted and square, and not allowing the actors to be in awe of something because they never knew what was in front of them. The negative response was incredibly loud following the release of the prequel trilogy, leading to the most popular online reviews, the Plinkett reviews, which are without a doubt products of their time, but they were also by far the biggest online example of criticism directed at these movies, and endlessly quoted themselves in online circles. But this trilogy still launched movies into the digital age. The technology that was created has led to plenty of movies down the line. I mean, big blue rooms, lots of CG backgrounds, actors not knowing what they're reacting to? Sounds a lot like how Marvel movies are made now. At the same time, the developments in pre-visualization helped the Lord of the Rings trilogy along, and of course, you can't mention 2000s visual effects without mentioning Transformers. Well, maybe you can, but I wanted to squeeze it in there, so. There was even a line of Star Wars Transformers toys. You could get a Luke Skywalker, an Obi-Wan, a couple Darth Vaders. I had a Clone Trooper guy as a kid. That was fun. Ultimately, the legacy of the prequels long-term has been a very strange one. While the movies themselves were endlessly derided by older fans, kids were able to grow attached to the new characters and ideas. Not to mention, fans could engage with the franchise in tons of different ways, with tons more books released working around the trilogy's new ideas. Video games also skyrocketed in the 2000s, with huge projects like Knights of the Old Republic released in 2003, the Battlefront duology in 2004 and 2005, the Force Unleashed duology in 2008 and 2010, set just after the prequel era, and even The Old Republic, a spiritual follow-up to Knights of the Old Republic, still taking place nearly 4,000 years before the events of the movies. But of course, you can't mention Star Wars video games without bringing up the greatest of them all, In the years after the prequel trilogy's release, Star Wars became the subject of the very earliest LEGO games, taking fans on abridged and funny adventures along the journey of the movies. First up was a game based around the prequel trilogy in 2005, quickly followed by LEGO Star Wars 2 in 2006, which centered on the original trilogy, which were both combined in 2007 for the complete saga. This game was huge, especially for people my age. You know, this is genuinely my first real conscious memory of Star Wars. This is how I was introduced to the whole saga, which then of course ballooned into me watching the DVDs a whole bunch when I was a kid, getting really invested in the franchise as a whole. But even still, this is where it all began. But among all of the ancillary material around the prequel trilogy specifically, there is one thing that managed to strengthen people's bond with this era more than anything else. This show was huge, keeping kids engaged week to week for the adventures of Obi-Wan, Anakin, and the army of clones facing off against the Separatists. A spiritual follow-up to the 2D show of almost the same name, even trying to translate some of those 2D designs into 3 dimensions, introducing a whole ton of new aspects and characters like the fan favorites Captain Rex and Ahsoka Tano, the latter being Anakin's Padawan learner. This show got kids invested into the Star Wars universe every week, and allowed this particular era in the franchise to expand to levels never seen before. Thanks to this show, the prequel era has become just as interesting as the original era. Given the longer runtime, the show was able to tackle things the movies either failed to do or couldn't do. We're able to see the downfall of the Republic and how it slowly morphed into the Empire. Darth Maul is brought back, striking right at the core of Obi-Wan, and the clones are greatly expanded, with tons of characters, each with their own separate personality, highlighted in things like the Umbara arc in Season 4. And then Ahsoka herself got lots of time in the spotlight, specifically in the final Season 5 arc where she's on the run from the Jedi. Not only exploring some of the flaws of the Jedi Council, but tackling Ahsoka's role in the whole thing and her relationship with the Jedi once all is said and done. The Clone Wars overall has done a lot to help build the prequel era into something far bigger, and it's thanks to that and the passage of time that a curious thing has happened. The Star Wars prequels have gone through a bit of a cultural reevaluation. The kids who grew up with these movies have become adults, they've grown their own voices. And now the prequel movies are the same to 90s and 2000s kids as the originals were to 70s and 80s kids. As mentioned, even I grew up with the full 6-movie set on DVD. This was the Star Wars saga when I was a kid, it's what I knew. I never really liked episodes 1 or 2 even when I was a kid, but I have always enjoyed episode 3 to a certain extent. I have tons of issues with it, but of the 3, it's the first I'll pop on and enjoy. And I think it's totally fine, cool even, that some have grown to profess their love of these movies. And it's certainly gotten back to the actors and creatives who made them, which I'm sure has been exceptionally gratifying after years of derision and hatred. The Star Wars prequels will always have their place in film history, especially for the immense cultural reception to them over time. The initial hype met with immeasurable disappointment, followed by a slow reevaluation. It's one of the strangest and most interesting cycles a series of movies has gone through. But now, with the prequel trilogy all said and done, the Star Wars saga is finally complete. All 6 movies were now on DVD, with episode 3 releasing towards the end of 2005. The whole set is finished. The story now has a complete beginning, middle, and end, with no intention from George Lucas to continue the story going forward.
What if someone else beside you came to you and said, I want to make episode 7? Could you see that happening?
No.
But some will always remember the grander plans from the generation past, the promises of a 9-movie saga, even a 12-movie saga. As conclusive as the prequel trilogy might have been, some fans inevitably began to ask, will there be a follow-up to Return of the Jedi? Will the Star Wars story continue? Will there be an episode 7? And perhaps more importantly than any of that, when?